Chapter 619. The next day, after a sincere exchange of technical terms, Aunt Susan finally acknowledged the young aristocrat's judgment. With the resentment of the palace above her head, she went to the upper house and exchanged the appropriate components with a verbal battle of words. Since then, Sulu, the war hero of the Federation, began his long career as an illegal assembly worker in the slums of the Empire's capital. He used the brain of a mechanic who designed the mech to design the wiring of a simple player, and used the fingers of a mechanic who repaired the mech to install the crude imitation components. Accompanied by dim lights and dark moonlight, he worked day and night without rest. This is a 6-jumper cable. The sensitivity value of the power induction brake switch must be adjusted according to the voltage stability of this block. If we follow the original design, I am afraid that we will have to restart 30 times to watch a movie. This yellow silicon particle box is the decoder stabilizing valve. The most critical part of the entire player is the decoding device. There are professionals responsible for the software. We don't have to worry about it, but we can expand the transmission rate of the storage channel as much as possible. Decoding rate? If it can be hard decoded, of course, the effect will be much better than soft decoding. But the problem is that even if we want to invade the computing frequency of the main chip, we still need a special hardware device. Cost. I'm not very clear about this. It will probably account for 7% of the cost. Sulu explained to the mother and son beside him while quickly flipping his 10 ordinary fingers. He easily and quickly assembled the player in front of him and then put in a basket on the side. Aunt Susan's eyes widened. She suddenly realized that she had misjudged the poor young aristocrat. His skill level was comparable to a skilled technical worker. Thinking of the hard decoding that this guy just mentioned, she scratched her head and asked in a rough voice, "I don't understand these technical terms, but if you can make the high-definition picture smoother, 7% of the cost should not be a big problem." "Brother, your work is so beautiful. I can't learn it." Aunt Susan's son, Paul, was on vacation today. He rushed back home from the second university. Like his mother, this young man was also extremely kind and full of sympathy. He had never opposed his mother's move to take in this exiled aristocrat. Today, Paul wanted to learn how to assemble machines from this young aristocrat so that his mother's life could be easier. However, he didn't expect that the young aristocrat's 10 nimble fingers would greatly hurt his self-confidence. Sulu smiled, revealing his neat white teeth, and said, "I have some talent in this area." Although it was only the simplest assembly process, with the help of the talented exiled noble, the pirated video player produced by Aunt Susan's courtyard was more stable, smoother, and clearer than the players of other competitors. More importantly, the decoding rate was incredible. With excellent performance, the player assembled by Aunt Susan gradually made a name for itself in the market industry. There were more and more repeat customers. Even the butlers of some noble houses in the city center came to buy it for their young masters. It was said that those young aristocrats were completely obsessed with the perfect restoration effect of this set of players on 3D ****. They couldn't stop themselves, and their hands were sore and their backs were aching. The business was getting better and better, and the money she earned was getting more and more. Aunt Susan simply took out a large sum of money to bribe the market management office and the fierce ruffians. She rented a small shop in the market and hired a middle-aged woman salesperson. From then on, she officially bid farewell to the restless life of a mobile vendor. Nearly 2 months had passed, and the Empire had entered the winter rain season. The food in the dilapidated and clean small courtyard was getting more and more abundant. Aunt Susan's hearty laughter was getting more and more frequent. Paul returned home more and more often. However, Sulu had been staying quietly in the attic and had not stepped out of the small courtyard. It was windy and rainy outside, and the Empire's people certainly did not relax their search for him. He began to ask Aunt Susan and Paul about the movement outside from time to time, but he did not try to go out of the door. The cold, icy rain gently knocked on the window. The small courtyard, which had paid enough heating fees this year, was as warm as spring. After dinner, the 3 people began to play cards in the attic to pass the time. This had become a routine program in the small courtyard. They were playing Imperial South Road flower cards. From time to time, Aunt Susan's laughter and Paul's morning voice sounded in the quiet attic. Sulu smiled and played card with the mother and son. But he knew very well that the mother and son were worried that they would get sick if they were confined in the attic for too long. Paul lost this game. The young college student rubbed his brown hair angrily and began to shuffle the cards. At this moment, Aunt Susan suddenly said, "You don't have to worry about implicating us. The people in this neighborhood we live in have always only cared about their own family affairs and are not interested in other people's affairs." Sulu was silent. He didn't expect Aunt Susan to guess his worries. I went to the Joint Defense Office and quietly looked at the wanted document. There is no three-dimensional image of you in the Noble list. Maybe those officials have long forgotten about you, an inconspicuous little guy. Aunt Susan looked into his eyes seriously. You can't hide in the attic all your life. These days, you often look out of the courtyard. I know you want to leave, but Aunt wants to say that if you want to leave, it's best to leave when you are sure you can leave. Paul also stopped shuffling the cards, looked at Sulu and frowned. Brother, there are many speculations about the truth of this rebellion in the school. Mom and I have asked you many times, but you refuse to say. Naturally, there are reasons that are inconvenient to say, but Mom is right. You'd better not take risks. Aunt Susan was silent for a moment, and then said again with a smile, "Remember to at least tell us when you leave." "Sure," Sulu replied very seriously. The city in the winter rain was like silk, like the dilapidated buildings in the slums shrouded in smoke. These were all the scenes that Sulu watched quietly by the window. Although this small courtyard was so warm, he didn't belong here after all, and had to leave eventually. He didn't know what the situation of his hometown federation was now. Had the troops attacked? Had the guys in Group 7 already gone to the battlefield with guns? What kind of situation were those dear friends in? On the third day after that night's conversation, he carefully dyed his black hair in a light brown with the hair dye bought by Aunt Susan, carefully trimmed his eyebrows, put on the color-changing contact lenses bought by Paul, and walked out of the small courtyard for the first time. Gradually, the friends in the market who were familiar with Aunt Susan and the few neighbors in the streets knew that a poor relative had come to Susan's house to seek refuge. The people living in the capital city of Tianjin had a natural sense of pride. Even if they lived in the slums, it was still a slum where they could see the towering palace walls from afar. In the eyes of the country people, the slums where they could feel the aura of Her Majesty up close was still a great place. Such scenes of seeking refuge were played out countless times every day. Who would care about the strict household registration inspection system of the empire? In this quiet life, the continuous winter of icy rain passed, and the charming spring came and went. The life of the people in the slums repeated over and over again, as if nothing had changed. Suli's life was the same. He assembled pirated video players in the attic, accompanied Aunt Susan at night to talk about her emotional past, and occasionally gave Paul pointers on the difficult problems in the university's mechanical department. His life was as steady as a river that didn't flow, a lake that hadn't yet filled. In fact, he wanted to leave, but he couldn't. Under the cold gaze of those hidden in the winter rain and spring breeze, he couldn't leave through the normal route. The Empire's ordinary shipping system couldn't get close at all, so he could only try to get close to the Empire's underground society and use the smuggling channels of those dark forces to leave the planet. However, before his plan could start, he was stunned to find that this route had been completely cut off long ago. Through the idle chatter of the neighbors and the discussions that Paul brought back from campus, he knew the whole story. A few months ago, the Empire's military department suddenly sent a cold final notice to the underground world of Tianjin through the relevant channels, ordering those dark forces to immediately stop all smuggling operations immediately. Such a situation rarely happened in history because the people in power knew very well that these underground worlds were in existence that the entire empire couldn't completely erase from the roots. These underground world smugglers often represented the secret interests of those great aristocrats and even members of the royal family. What's more, it was extremely difficult for them to immediately stop all smuggling transactions. Sure enough, With the support of those royal family members and great aristocrats, the underground world of Tianjin did not immediately stop the military department's request. What followed was a bloody massacre that made the entire empire's underground world tremble. All the smuggling spaceships that dared to leave the surface of the planet were coldly destroyed by the military fleet before they could break through the atmosphere. The warships that fired thousands of cannons didn't seem to care about what goods those spaceships were carrying or which family they belonged to. The biggest smugglers were secretly arrested by the Imperial Anti-Smuggling Department on the same day, and no one saw them again. As for their smuggling base, under the powerful firepower of the Empire's military, it was turned into a pile of broken building blocks made of countless corpses. The most shocking part of the rumor was that the royal family members and aristocrats behind the smugglers were unceremoniously invited back to the dark courtroom by the Imperial Intelligence Agency officials. No aristocrat dared to resist because it was said that His Highness personally led the team. Most people in the Empire society didn't understand why the royal family would think of a bloodbath in the underground world and spend so much effort to crack down on smugglers. Some people linked this incident to the aristocratic rebellion not long ago, but one person knew very well that all this was just to cut off the possibility of him escaping. Huai Chaoshi, you're really ruthless. Sulu walked through the muddy market, haggling with the vendors who were covered in mud as he collected the fish in a basket with a smile on his face. Suddenly, he raised his head and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the majestic imperial palace in the distance, feeling helpless and disappointed in his heart. Chapter 620. An engineer's way of thinking was very logical. It was okay to make bold assumptions, but one had to be careful when seeking verification. When the object of research was a non-repeatable life, one would be even more careful when seeking verification. Before he was certain, Su Lu would definitely not take risks because of the desire in his heart and the vague hope that seemed to exist. The Federation should be in the summer or autumn of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar. It was spring on the Empire's Tianjin planet. While he was here, he was thinking about the summer and autumn on the other side. He lived quietly in the slums. Looking at the ordinary slums of the Empire who were busy day after day and thinking about his own situation, he suddenly seemed to be able to understand how they felt. The universe was so big and so beautiful that they could only stay on the surface for the rest of their lives unless they went to war. Just like the people of the East Woods district back then, they were still bound by heavy gravity in life, even though they were in the magnificent space age. He was not very familiar with his neighbors, but he could exchange a few words with them. Not many people could remember his extremely ordinary face, but the vegetable vendors that he frequented had already started to leave vegetables for him. The longer he lived in the capital of the Empire, the stranger Su Lu felt. These extremely ordinary, irritable, and honest people of the Empire would occasionally talk about the distant space war. When they mentioned the people of the Federation, they would always become abnormally angry and want to eat all the men of the Federation alive and snatch all the women of the Federation to be their wives. Where did this anger and fanaticism come from? Was it an invasion in textbooks or a racial hatred that had been passed down for many years? These vegetable sellers, vegetable buyers, protection fee collectors, protection fee payers, old people, young people, men, women, and the ordinary slums of the Empire were all the Federation's irreconcilable enemies? Sulu really found it hard to associate these people with beasts. He could not understand. Was it this group of people who slaughtered the Federation's civilians like pigs and dogs on the Westwoods? War should not only make women go away, it should also make civilians go away. Leaving Aunt Susan's dilapidated courtyard more and more often, he walked further and further away at will. Often, he would subconsciously pass by the courtyard whose walls were painted all white. In fact, this was not a subconscious action. This courtyard occupied a very large area. The buildings in the courtyard were not tall and did not exceed 3 floors. Looking from afar, they were basically all luxurious wooden structures. Whether it was the walls or the wooden pillars, they were all painted white. It was so white that it made people feel solemn. The white courtyard was surrounded by tall trees, and there was a faint fragrance of flowers coming from inside. The streets outside the courtyard were extremely clean, and there were many soldiers in plain clothes looking around vigilantly in the shadows, which made them seem somewhat out of place in this slum that was full of dirt and garbage. Sulu would often pass through half of the alley. Every now and then, he would see ordinary citizens of the Empire kneeling on the flagstones outside the white courtyard, prostrating themselves on the ground and murmuring pious and fanatical prayers. Nobody dared to disturb them. One day, after buying 2 cans of metal adhesive in a hardware store, Sulu walked through the alley and came to a restaurant that sold caviar. He bought 2 packs of caviar, but did not leave immediately. Instead, he ordered an unknown light drink and sat on the seat facing the street on the 2nd floor. He drank the caviar and ate happily. The corner of his eyes drifted to the white courtyard that he had been observing for a long time. Master Fan Manor. Regarding this Master Fan Manor and the title of the great teacher, there was no record in the Federation's intelligence. He only vaguely remembered hearing the old man mention it once. But according to his understanding, especially the story told by Huai Chaoshi, he knew very well what this Master Fan Manor and the great teacher inside meant to the Empire. He did not know what kind of person the current great teacher was, but he knew that this courtyard was related to the imperial family of the Empire's Baijin dynasty through marriage for generations. A certain Master Fan had once crossed the universe and taught 2 students, Li Pifu and Feng Yu. To be able to teach 2 such heaven-defying existences, what kind of heaven-defying existence was this person himself? From a certain point of view, the previous owner of this white courtyard could be considered his grandmaster. Looking at this quiet and mysterious manor, even with Su Li's strong will, he could not help but feel a little uneasy. He knew that this place was definitely heavily guarded. He knew that there was definitely an extremely powerful existence in a Master Fan Manor. He knew that he should not have come here to take the risk, but in the end, he still came. This was because he had too many questions in his heart that needed answers. The secret of the bracelet, the secret of the chip replacement, the secret of the 8 Raishinshi. These secrets were very important to his life. More importantly, the great teacher had once crossed the universe and quietly entered the Federation. How'd he do it? Where was that amazing spaceship now? The star chart that the old military god had mentioned in prison. Was it the shortcut that Master Fan had taken back then? Su Lu chewed on his caviar and narrowed his eyes as he looked over, not noticing that the crumbs were falling from the corner of his mouth. In the face of the imperial family's tyrannical and even somewhat crazy search and interception operations, he had to safely leave this planet, leave the Empire, and return to the Federation. It seemed that he could take the old path that his predecessors had taken, but this path might be even more difficult. Just a few days ago, the Imperial Military Police once again combed through the slums. Although they still did not discover his existence, it already made him feel uneasy. Time seemed to be running out, and he was getting more and more nervous. However, to break into this white courtyard and investigate the mysterious Master Fan Manor, from a rational point of view, was not a wise choice. It was more like a suicide mission. This decision was too hard to make. Right at this moment, a huge commotion suddenly came from the streets in the distance. Sulu was shocked to find that many of the Empire's citizens had put down what they were doing and were rushing over. Gradually, the earth-shattering commotion turned into orderly, angry shouts. Race not destroyed. Fight to the end. Kill the Federation. Long live the Empire. Long live the Emperor. Fight till S1. Kill. Autumn of the 71st year of the Federation's constitutional calendar. Spring of the 724th year of the Empire's White Hibiscus Dynasty's imperial calendar. The Federal Fleet, consisting of 1,400 warships, passed through the 2 giant warp holes in the Night Scorpion Nebula and Gary Corridor at the same time. The Federal Fleet easily defeated the Empire's border fleet and headed straight for the Virgo Galaxy in the southwestern star region of the Empire. The Third Cosmic War officially broke out. The vast sea of stars that had just calmed down was once again lit up by the flames of war. Chapter 622. That night, Paul rushed home from the Second University. His clothes were full of traces of inferior paint. During dinner, he picked up 3 pieces of wheat vegetables in a daze. Finally, he could not bear the puzzled eyes of his mother and Su Lu. He put down his chopsticks, lowered his head, and said, "I have signed up for military special training." Aunt Susan took a deep breath in surprise, covered her mouth, and did not speak. Sulu looked at Paul's young face, hesitated for a moment, and persuaded. "Now, the Federation has just passed through the space channel, and the situation is not so tense. You are a mechanical college student. How can it be your turn to fight? I have to be prepared at all times." Paul replied very seriously, "Brother, I know you have resentment against the Empire. In fact, we do too. The problem is that our country has reached a moment of life and death. Our compatriots are trapped in blood and fire. Brother, forget the hatred related to political conspiracies." He patted Su Li's shoulder and said with emotion, "We are not fighting for His Majesty, but for ourselves." Aunt Susan slowly put down the spoon in her hand, and a proud and gratified expression flashed across her chubby face. She put her hand on her son's thin shoulder and said in a gentle voice, "Do what you want to do." "Okay." Paul nodded hard. Sulu was silent, looking at the young man of the Empire beside him and thinking that he might walk on the battlefield full of blood and fire. He was a little nervous. He wanted to teach him some life-saving skills on the battlefield, but on second thought, wouldn't this be too irresponsible to his compatriots? Su Lu was a foreign young man who had saved his life and had a very good relationship with him. Now, he was about to enter the battlefield. Perhaps one day, he would hold a gun barrel and spit at him, and then cry as they bid each other farewell. Generally speaking, Su Lu should be very depressed and struggling with a headache. However, since he had seen too many scenes of comrades dying or surviving by luck on the battlefield in the West Woods, especially this time when he was captured by the Empire, Su Li's personality changed. Or it could be said that he returned to the psychological state of the orphan on Zhonglo Street in Donglin. For problems that could not be solved temporarily, not only could he not think about it, but he was also full of confidence with a sly aura. He believed that if that day really came, he would definitely be able to find a solution. Paul was busy with military training and parading in the streets. Aunt Susan was busy making money and then changing the money into hard currency that was not easy to depreciate. Sometimes she would go to the management office to give wartime gifts. Sulu, a soldier of the Federation, did not have the consciousness of being their enemy. He still repaired pirated video players and polished all kinds of inferior metal devices, as usual, living a quiet and warm life in the small courtyard and attic. No one knew that when he went to the hardware store every day, he would always sit in the restaurant in the alley next to the white courtyard for a long time. He silently and attentively observed the environment of the house and the movements around it. Then, he would memorize everything he saw in his mind. When he returned to the attic of the house, he would draw it on the map. The engineer's meticulous way of thinking made him unusually serious about his preparation work, to the point that he was so serious about every detail. Even so, he still felt that his impulse to enter Masterfan's manor was a little crazy. After all, it was an existence with a taste of history and mystery. And after so many years had passed, who knew where the amazing spaceship that the previous Masterfan had taken was? Was the star map of the third passage between the Federation and the Empire still in Masterfan's mansion? On a calm and impermanent night, the warm fragrance of bean paste buns was steaming under the attic. Aunt Susan was humming one of the most famous and most vulgar online songs in the Empire, happily waiting for her son's return. Paul had already finished the special military training at the Second University. If the situation of the Universe War in the future developed to be extremely unfavorable to the Empire, even the civilians of Tianjin had to join the battle. Paul, who had good grades in the mechanic department, would definitely become a reserve member very much needed by an armored division. Aunt Susan, who had a tragic life, couldn't have any good feelings for the Empire's royal family and those dignitaries because of the tragic death of her parents and brothers. In her opinion, this country was undoubtedly a tragic world. But as Paul said to Sulu, ordinary Empire civilians, and even slaves, facing the situation of the Federation's large-scale attack, simply put down their hatred for this society in an instant and filled their hearts with love for their hometown, supporting mothers to send their sons to the battlefield with laughter and tears. Sulu was in the attic, smelling the warm aroma of food from the market below. He shook his head lightly and walked to the window. He glanced at the distant Fan Manor shrouded in dust and fog, and the new moon that had just risen above the white courtyard. He slowly closed the window tightly, not leaving a single gap. His left foot slightly stepped forward, his right foot pulled back horizontally, his knees bent at a 60-degree angle, his left hand clenched and retracted his waist, and his right hand stretched out horizontally, but his fingertips curled strangely. He silently maintained this posture for 10 minutes. Then, he retracted his feet and changed to another strange posture. These postures were obviously against the common sense of the human body. At the very least, he didn't like the reverse-jointed elbows and knees and the trembling thigh muscles and fibers. These were the 10 postures he had practiced since he was a child. Gradually, trembling was born from the muscles and fibers that were constantly being twisted, squeezed, and rubbed all over his body. Then, it turned into a magical burning power that was hidden under his wheat-colored skin. Following an irregular path, it was transmitted to every part of his body, every finger, every strand of hair, and the tiny holes under each strand of hair. The air in the attic seemed to feel some kind of attraction, and a gust of wind came out of nowhere, slowly flowing around his almost absolutely still body, intimately communicating with the invisible power that seeped out of those pores, rubbing together and then dispersing. The magical power that he had practiced for more than 10 years was silently called the tremor magic when he was a child. Only now did he know that this power actually had a name called 8 Rice. However, just as he learned the name, the powerful power in his body was cut off by Huai Caoshi's even more powerful and irresistible power. With his life as a bet, Su Lu fearlessly broke through the seal of that finger, and all the meridians in his body were shattered, turning him into a paralyzed patient. After that, this Donglin stone endured pain that ordinary people absolutely could not endure, and actually forcibly picked up all the scattered power in his body piece by piece. Not only did he recover his original power, he even had a faint leap in some level. Su Lu felt this, but his body was too weak during the escape, and there was no way to know how big the scale of this improvement was. It was not until Aunt Susan saved him and allowed him to stay in the attic that he somewhat inconceivably discovered a lot of problems. He slightly narrowed his eyes, looked at the headphones on the straw mat, slowly raised his hands, and felt the scorching heat spewing out from behind his waist. It no longer followed the previous path, but rushed straight out from the inside of his body like a running bison, rushing over his chest, rushing over his shoulder, rushing over his upper arm, rushing over the tip of his elbow, and rushing into his palm. His palm was still the palm with calluses, but there was a real feeling of swelling filling it, and it seemed to be bigger than what he saw with his eyes. The scorching power was like the air in a balloon constantly pouring into his palm, making his 10 fingers feel swollen and sour. Especially the skin of the fingertips became very sensitive, as if he could feel the slightest flow in the air. Su Lu suddenly frowned, softly groaned, and stretched out his 10 fingers in the air, suddenly flicked. A series of slight crackling sounds suddenly sounded in the air, as if some kind of invisible power was penetrating the air, and the headphones on the straw mat 2 meters away from him strangely moved their position in a very strange way. A cool and refreshing wind reverberated in the attic, stirring up a few strands of dust that he usually did not pay attention to. Su Lu slowly opened his mouth wide, revealing a mouth full of neat white teeth. He pulled back his hands in front of him, carefully and seriously and shockingly and admiringly, like an engineer admiring the beautiful electron beam that he could never analyze with his intelligence. This was not the first time that he had discovered the so-called Jinshi overflow phenomenon, but he was still deeply shocked. Opening the window again, Su Lu looked at Master Fan's mansion in the distance under the moonlight, could not help but shrug his shoulders, put on the headphones, and carefully listened to the communication over there through the electronic pulse monitor. This electronic pulse monitor, with a simple appearance, was made by the parts he purchased in the hardware store in the past 2 months. With his mechanical skills, it was easy to complete this tool, and it did not let the Imperial Engineering Supervision find any abnormalities. Lifting the straw curtain, prying open the somewhat rotten floor, and taking out a pistol with a metallic luster, Sulu silently did the final maintenance, and then stuffed the weapon that he hid before he passed out under his clothes. "You don't want to eat?" Aunt Susan looked at him walking down the attic in surprise, waving a spatula, and said, "You don't like bean paste buns? I also made a pot of chowder soup." "There's something that I need to take care of," replied Sulu with a smile. Aunt Susan had always supported his courage to communicate with the outside world. He had to have the courage to treat the Empire's wanted list as shit, so she did not force him to stay. She continued to wave the spatula and shouted, "The curfew is not strict now, but there are a lot of people on the streets. You have to be careful and come back early." "Okay." Sulu walked out of the small courtyard, walked through the alley, stepped on the mud and garbage, and narrowed his eyes as he walked toward the white building. As he walked, he became more and more nervous. "I'm not an ordinary person. Well, people who can use their fingers as engines are generally not human." Chapter 6:23. Sulu was an ordinary person who did not take the usual path. However, as a fugitive from the Federation who was crazily wanted by the Empire, he actually dared to carry a gun and charge into the white courtyard alone. Even he himself admitted that the path he chose was a bit too steep. This matter was a bit too crazy. Based on this psychological expectation, when he arrived at the third side door of the Great Master Fan Manor, answered a few simple questions according to the information he obtained from the eavesdropping, and walked in without any obstruction, he could not help but feel a lot of absurd and indescribable feelings. "What are you doing here?" The white-haired butler of the Great Master Fan Manor asked expressionlessly. "I'm here to fix the heating lines." Sulu swallowed a mouthful of saliva to moisten his somewhat dry throat and handed over a crudely forged card that he had spent an entire night making. Somewhat unnaturally, he explained, "Last winter, the heating lines in the remote residence exploded twice. The Bureau asked us to hurry up and fix it so that there won't be any more problems when winter comes." There was still a long way until the next winter. Although it was true that the Bureau had recently sent engineers into the Great Master Fan Manor to do maintenance, Sulu still felt that this reason was not very tenable, not to mention that the forged card was really easy to see through. Unexpectedly, the white-haired butler did not even glance at the card. He frowned and waved his hand, leading him in. The moment he entered the courtyard and closed the door, Sulu subconsciously glanced at the dark shadows of the trees outside the Great Master Fan Manor. After observing for several days, he knew very well how many elite forces of the Empire were responsible for the security work in the darkness. If the Great Master Fan Manor discovered that there was something wrong with him, who knew how many bullets would shoot through him? But he just had to enter like this? Just like this, he entered the most mysterious Great Master Fan Manor of the Empire like a joke? Don't make any noise. There are many old scholars in the manor who do historical research. They hate metal, so they also hate the sound of metal colliding. The white-haired old butler clearly did not care about this brown-haired maintenance worker, coldly telling him what to pay attention to. "Don't cough. The people in the manor are all old. They like to cough, so they don't like to hear other people cough. Don't run around. There are no traps in the mansion, and there are no dogs. However, even a cleaner in the mansion has a license to kill. If you make too much noise when you run around, it will affect his mood." Sulu obediently carried his toolbox and followed behind the butler. He seemed to be carefully listening to these strange and threatening warnings, but in fact his slightly drooping eyes were constantly sweeping around him. From the outside of Master Fan Manor, he could not see much of what was going on inside. Now that it was rare to enter, he had to carefully examine the terrain and analyze the functions of each area to facilitate his later search or escape again. "Don't look around." The white-haired old housekeeper seemed to know what Sulu was doing without turning his head. Or perhaps it was because every outsider who could enter the Fan Manor in the past couldn't help but look around curiously, so he coldly added this sentence. Along the way, all he saw were corners and trees. He didn't see too many valuable things until he entered the pipeline control room in a remote corner. He was left alone. Gently placing the toolbox on the ground, Sulu looked at the complicated pipeline lines in front of him and frowned deeply. For a full 10 seconds, he did not move at all. He was not confused by the complicated pipelines in front of him. No matter how complicated the mechanical pipelines were, as long as there were corresponding external paint labels, he could sort out the pipeline structure in the shortest amount of time and find the one that needed to be repaired or not. The reason why he frowned and fell into deep thought was the process of entering this white courtyard. Closely related to the Empire's Hibiscus dynasty, the incomparably mysterious Master Fan Manor, he had entered so easily. This fact that had already happened made him feel somewhat inconceivable. There was no strict search, no multiple verification of identity, and even the toolbox at his feet had not been opened. What was the use of those elite troops of the Empire's military outside the manor? He narrowed his eyes and looked at the deep and peaceful night outside the window of the pipeline room and the tall trees swaying gently in the spring breeze. He felt that there was a problem somewhere, but he didn't know where the problem was. He felt that there was something strange hidden in the peaceful courtyard, but he didn't know where it was. Gently and silently exhaling, he squatted down and opened the heavy toolbox to begin his work. Since he had already entered this place, then regardless of whether there was a problem or not, he had to continue walking. He pulled up the historical data on the monitoring screen beside him and found the few pipelines with the least amount of sewage discharge. Then, he opened the central valve in the pipeline room and silently placed the high carbon rods that were sampled and analyzed into each pipeline in order. Among them, there was one pipeline with the least amount of sewage discharge in history, and there was more flocculant inside. Su Li's eyebrows raised slightly and waited for the results of the high carbon rods to appear on the light screen. Indeed, the sewage discharge from this pipeline did indeed contain the most K2 factor. He had already checked before. K2 was the most commonly used cleaning agent in the high-level libraries of the Empire. The question was, why were there so many flocculant? Could it be that the archive room of the Master Fan Mansion was still using plant fiber books? Although he was hesitant in his heart, there was no hesitation in his actions. He took out 2 rubber pads from the toolbox and stuck them on the pipeline. He pulled out a wire and connected it to a small metal box. Then, he took out a rubber rod and gently knocked on the metal pipeline. No one could hear the sound, but the shock wave produced by the collision between the rubber rod and the metal pipe quickly flowed into the ground along the pipe. It continued to move forward until it reached the exit at the end. Then, it turned back again and entered the rough sonar receiver modified by Sulu through the 2 rubber pads. The Master Fan Mansion was very big. Sulu had no way to confirm where the room he was looking for was, so he could only choose this way. After confirming the location of the archive room, he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he took out a low-end rotary screen workbench that was often used by maintenance workers from the bottom of the toolbox and connected it to the cable that he pulled out from the depths of the underground. He wanted to hack into the surveillance system of the Master Fan Mansion. No, to be more precise, he wanted to synchronize with the surveillance system. Although it was easy to enter, and this white courtyard was as unguarded as a brothel, Sulu was extremely vigilant in front of his teacher's old residence and the most mysterious name in the Empire. He didn't dare to take too many risks, and he didn't believe that he could hack into the other party's surveillance system without being discovered. After putting on the earplugs, he hung the miniature light screen over his left eye, loaded the pistol, and took a deep breath to let the burning power surge through his body. He could use the power of a leopard's speed at any time. After finishing all the preparations, Sulu tightly closed the door of the archive room. His body suddenly shrank, turned into a shadow, and went out through the window. Then, he hid in the shadows of the flowers and trees. With his current strength, or state, or the speed that he could burst out with, under the cover of the night, it was difficult for a normal surveillance camera to capture his figure. Once he stopped, even if someone walked past him, it would be difficult to discover his existence. He walked in the courtyard like a shadow, carefully avoiding all the dangers and moving towards his target. The Master Fan Mansion was much bigger than it looked from the outside. To reach the archive room, he had to go through a lot of places. On the way forward, there was the sound of the TV news, the sound of arguments, and a unique buzzing sound of tapping on the diaphragm keyboard. These sounds made him feel a little strange. It was as if this courtyard wasn't some mysterious high-ranking official's mansion, but rather a campus full of the smell of youth. On the way forward, he saw a lot of buildings, and the outer walls of these buildings were all painted white. Even if there were traces of time and wind and rain, it still gave a feeling of cleanliness that made people feel a little cold. He didn't know how many turns he took, but through the branches in front of him, Sulu suddenly saw a stone wall that wasn't white. His body slightly stiffened and stopped in his tracks. There were a few lines of scribbled words on the stone wall. A person with a pure heart has a boundless future. He narrowed his eyes, thinking that the guy who founded the Master Fan Mansion must have been an artistic youth who needed to be cured. The people of the Federation kept criticizing the big shots of the Empire, so he didn't notice that below the line of Empire characters, there was a line of smaller words. There was no trace of light in the room, no sound, and no one. There was only the faint smell of plant fiber moisture resistance medicine and the unique low electric current of the disk array. There should be countless old books and a huge amount of electronic data stored inside. Su Li's eyes narrowed again, and his eyelids were a little dry. He observed for a long time in the dark and confirmed that this all-alloy room didn't have any overly heaven-defying security measures. Su Li used a tool to deactivate several of the triggering alarm systems. Then, he crouched before the dark door and spent 3 minutes unlocking the door. Slowly, he pushed open the door, revealing a small gap. Then he slipped in. He was more grateful than ever for the lock knowledge that the uncle taught him. At the same time, he confirmed once again that as long as he wanted to, he could become the most amazing thief in the universe at any time. Some pride and contentment surged into his mind, but it was immediately frozen by the scene in front of him. As far as the eye could see, the room was filled with black cloths. These thick black cotton cloths had a light blocking rate of about 100%. They hung from the ceiling and draped down to the ground. They were like black space partitions, forcibly cutting the three-dimensional space into countless small compartments. Sulu looked at these black cloths in surprise. Looking at the books and discs in the grid formed by the black cloths, he vaguely understood that the black cloths were probably used as partitions, but he didn't know why they were like that. He didn't have much time. First, he quickly browsed through the paper books on the bookshelves and found that there should be many secrets of the Empire in them, but they were of no use to him. He flipped through 4 black cloths in a row, but the result was still the same. Somewhat relaxed, he casually lifted a black cloth again, but a light flashed into his eyes. Su Li's eyes narrowed, knowing that he wouldn't be able to put down the black cloth in time. His right hand pulled out a pistol like lightning, and his finger pressed the trigger tightly, aiming at the back of the figure behind the black cloth. It was the back of a middle-aged man. Chapter 624. Before entering Master Fan Manor, Sulu had spent dozens of days observing and eavesdropping. From his disguise to a series of detailed problems, he had made ample preparations. The details decided everything, and the details seemed to have decided that he could enter so easily. Although he had made so many preparations, he still didn't have the slightest bit of confidence. This was because this white manor was unknown in the Federation, but to the Empire, it was too important. The smell of history was too strong. The bracelet he had come into contact with when he was young, and the story of Twilight in the Palace City made him particularly cautious of this place. Because of this kind of psychological preparation, even if there was an electromagnetic cannon hidden behind the black cloth, or dozens of invisible mecha that were far beyond the level of modern technology suddenly popped out of thin air, he might not be surprised, but the scene before his eyes shocked him so much that he could not speak, and his body stiffened. Whether it was the Federation or the Empire, their history was written by a combination of pen and gun. At this moment, his hand was tightly gripping the cold metal gun, and the muzzle of the gun was aimed at the man who casually asked about Schiller's novels. That was the content of the novel, the pen, and the words. It was very different from the current atmosphere, as if a wandering poet had suddenly appeared on a bloody battlefield. It was either pretentious or stupid. I've read many of Schiller's novels, but I don't have much of a literary opinion. Su Li's footsteps were soft and silent, and he expressionlessly took 2 steps forward. The muzzle of the gun was pressed against the back of the man's head. The strange feeling made him subconsciously lower his voice as he answered. The middle-aged man wore an extremely ordinary thin coat. The hem was a little long, and it covered his legs and knees. The room was warm like spring, so he wasn't afraid of the cold. He didn't seem to feel the cold metal gun at the back of his head. He scratched his head, put down the pen in his hand, and turned back with a frown. Reckless men like you, who only know how to fight, have never studied comparative literature or genre literature. My question was a little redundant, but since you've read so much, quickly recite a few of my novels. The Empire's collection of information is still problematic. Those idiots sent by the military always think that novels are not serious business. They only know how to draw maps. There are still a few of Schiller's early novels that haven't been collected yet. Sulu looked at the face of the middle-aged man under the muzzle of the gun. His finger on the trigger couldn't help but tremble slightly. He didn't know why, but he had a strong urge to blow this face into pieces. It wasn't because this face was too ugly, too wretched, or too frivolous. It was because this face was too beautiful. Sulu had seen many handsome men in his life. There is no need to mention the delicate and pretty by Magnolia and the gloomy Li Qishao for the time being. Sure, Qinghai, who had a mesmerizing face and peach blossom eyes, was his best friend. He had enough tolerance for a man with a beautiful face, but at this time, he was almost unable to suppress the jealousy and hatred in the depths of his heart. This man from the Empire had a head full of white hair. He was not young, but his face was so perfect that it made people jealous. He was even closer to the category of monsters than Mr. Sure. It was enough to make all the men hate him and feel that the creator was a bastard. Don't tremble with your fingers. The middle-aged man from the Empire tried to move the gun barrel away from his forehead, but he found that Su Li's hand was very tight. He helplessly gave up the idea and said innocently, "I know that many male animals have the urge to destroy my face when they look at it, but this has nothing to do with me. It's my parents. To be more precise, it's a biological mark passed down by some ancestor." He continued with emotion, "The greatest tragedy in the world is to destroy beautiful things and display the process for others to see. I admit that my face is the source of countless tragedies." Su Li's knuckles turned slightly white as he gripped the gun. He found that this mysterious man in front of him was not only ridiculously beautiful, but also nag and narcissism to an outrageous extent. "Who exactly are you?" He knew that his question didn't have much power, because it was too cliché, but this was the question he was most nervous about at the moment. "This is Master Fan's mansion." The man from the Empire looked at him with a smile. His bright eyes were unusually charming, and even the few wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had an indescribable feeling. "So," Su Li's thick eyebrows raised slightly. "So, I'm naturally the great teacher." According to the background introduction of Huai Caoshi's story, the great teacher was a great title that was inherited by a certain family. This family of unknown origins helped the Huai family establish the Hibiscus dynasty, and for more than 700 years, they had been hiding behind the scenes to support the royal family's rule over the vast star region. Every great teacher naturally became the teacher of the empire's emperor, so the title of great teacher gradually became an actual position. This kind of existence was definitely amazing, especially when he knew that the former great teacher had taught Li Pifu and Feng Yu, the pair of brothers. Sula no longer doubted this point. He had thought that the current great teacher might have 3 heads and 6 arms as thick as thighs, but he didn't expect that when he really met him, he would still be severely shocked. "All right, I admit that I'm not a guest." Sula took a deep breath to calm himself down. His finger that was stroking the trigger relaxed, but he was ready to pull at any moment. He intimately pressed the muzzle of the gun between the beautiful face's eyebrows and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "I seem to have to admit that you seem to know that I was coming and have been waiting for me. But the problem is, do you know who I am? The entire empire is looking for you." Great teacher Fan smiled and replied, "But other than His Majesty and Shao Shi, probably no one knows your true identity. But if others don't know, how can I not know? Please try to be concise." Sula gradually calmed down. He twisted his lips and pressed the muzzle forward without hesitation. The great teacher frowned because of this action. He then stood up, as if he wasn't worried that Sulu would pull the trigger at all. He waved his hand and said, "You are Nasri's son, so you should be Jian Shue'er's half-brother. Based on this relationship, you should also call me uncle. Is it popular in the Federation to point a gun at one's uncle's head and shout kill? Well, if we don't start from my poor sister or from my poor father who died in the hands of an old man, Nasri and I are brothers. I am a disciple of the sect leader." Does the Federation have such a cute title? Listening to the middle-aged man in front of him talking nonstop, Sulu suddenly felt as if all the sounds in the room were being absorbed by the black cloth that was everywhere. He couldn't hear anything at all, but the words were clearly transmitted into his mind. There were too many plots and clues in a few simple sentences. It was so complicated that even his logical brain was a little confused. "Wait, this is a little too complicated. You have to let me sort out first." Sulu reached out his left hand with a headache, indicating for the other to stop. "Oh, the relationship between the great families has always been very complicated. If you're interested, you can study the history." The great teacher continued excitedly. Sulu helplessly moved the muzzle of the gun down a little and blocked the great teacher's mouth. With an extremely serious expression, he said, "Let's start from the beginning. You said that Jian Shue'er has to call you uncle. Does that mean that her mother is your elder sister or younger sister?" Logically speaking, the great teacher, who should be incomparably honorable and serious, was now squeezing his extraordinarily beautiful face, ignoring the cold muzzle of the gun in his mouth, and vaguely explaining, "I said that she is my elder sister." "So your elder sister is the former great teacher's younger daughter? Then what are you?" Sulu thought of the story that Huai Chaoshi had told him and asked in confusion. The muzzle of the gun subconsciously moved away. "She is the younger daughter, and I am the younger son. This relationship is very simple. The former great teacher is my father, and my elder sister is my father's daughter. Isn't it natural? So, Jian Shue'er and Huai Chaoshi are half-sisters." Sulu opened his small eyes wide and came to an incredible conclusion. The great teacher looked at him and nodded. He spread his hands and said, "Jian Shue'er made His Majesty wear a green hat. Otherwise, why would he go crazy whenever he saw Jian Shue'er? But you don't have to worry too much about the incestuous relationship between you and Shao Shi. She and Jian Shue'er are half-sisters. You and Jian Shue'er are half-sisters, and you and Shao Shi are half-sisters." Sula felt a headache coming on. The great teacher was focusing on the main point, so he asked, "Then the current great teacher of the empire is Jian Shue'er's uncle and also Huai Caoshi's uncle. I am very proud to have two nieces who are the most outstanding in their respective fields," the great teacher said with satisfaction. He waved his arm again, causing the thin coat on his body to flutter in the wind, revealing his bare thighs and a corner of his underwear. Sula didn't expect this important person to have such a strange habit of dressing. The words he wanted to say were stuck in his throat. He silently thought about these complicated things, and his feelings were indescribable. Of course, he knew that he wasn't the great teacher's son, but it seemed that the empire insisted on this, so these complicated relationships involved him. "I don't think you waited for me just to tell me a story." He narrowed his eyes, not looking at the middle-aged man's thighs. He shrugged and said, "Actually, I don't even know how you guessed that I would be able to escape and enter the great teacher Fan Manor. I heard that Nasri died. You inherited his legacy, so of course you were able to escape successfully." The great teacher smiled and said, "Several decades ago, when I was still young, I ordered him as his brother-in-law to find a way to take me to the Federation to play. Only then did he create that little blue thing. Although he didn't keep his word and didn't take me to the Federation, I thought that since you had that little blue thing on you, how could the Empire's surveillance catch you? As for why I guessed that you would come to the Great Teacher fan manor, the reason is very simple. The Great Teacher completely ignored his pistol and naturally turned to pick up the teacup on the table. His thin clothes fluttered like an immortal, and his two thighs were a shocking sight. Student Huai Fuchai will go completely crazy when he hears the names Li Pifu and Nasri. If you want to live, or even go back, of course you have to find someone to help you. But you're alone in the Empire. Who can you find? The Great Teacher's legs were bare. He smiled and said, "After all, we are relatives. Although we don't interact much, we still have to visit each other occasionally." Chapter 6:25. It was another long paragraph, with the tone of an early Schiller script. Sulu vaguely understood what this relative of his was trying to convey. Due to the vast relationship between them that spanned across the Federation and the Empire, this Imperial Master was willing to help him, but he was not willing to put too much effort into it. In other words, he did not have many good methods to deal with the wrath of the Imperial family. This paragraph also mentioned some things that happened decades ago. The Great Teacher had clearly wrongly attributed Su Li's ability to escape the surveillance of the Imperial chip to the small blue device, not knowing that he had the ability to extract the chip from the back of his neck. What Su Lu was thinking more about was that if the little blue device was the uncle's invention, then the image of the former master's pocket emitting blue light as he traveled around the Federation in her mind was naturally not real. It seemed that imagination was not the truth of history after all. If you are willing to help me leave the Empire, I will be very grateful. He slightly raised his chin, unwilling to look at the middle-aged man's naked legs. After a moment of silence, he continued, "I don't have a complete understanding of the things that happened back then, but I believe that since your father could enter the Federation on a spaceship alone, he must have a very impressive spaceship. That spaceship is indeed very impressive." The Great Teacher lifted his thin shirt and scratched his smooth thighs in an indecent manner. Then he lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. "But I don't know where it is. Besides, although the universe is vast, who knows how many Imperial warships are hidden in it? How did you get out?" Su Lu was silent again, guessing how much of what the Great Teacher said was true. He tightened his grip on the gun and then loosened it. Lowering his head, he said, "That star map?" The Great Teacher blew out a mouthful of light blue smoke and frowned his good-looking eyebrows. He said self-deprecatingly, "If I had a spaceship and a star map, I would have run to the Federation to play by myself. Do you know what a star map is?" The middle-aged man's inhumanly handsome face suddenly flashed with a hint of emotion. He held the cigarette in his mouth and gently exhaled the words with the smoke. "Lipifa might know a little, but he doesn't know where the star map is. Our Majesty, Student Huai Fu Cha, knows where the star map is hidden, but until today he does not know the true contents of the star map. As for the other big shots in the Imperium and the Federation, they know nothing at all. In the entire universe, only I know what that star map is, and only I know where it is." Master Fan held the cigarette between his index and middle finger and gently brushed his lush white hair. The smoke entered his hair and lingered for a long time before slowly dissipating. It was like a nebula in the sky, showing a sense of vicissitudes at an unbearably slow speed. Sulu was still silently holding the pistol, aiming at his head. He listened quietly and didn't say anything unnecessary. He played the role of a quiet listener very well. "Because the star map originally belonged to our family." The slightly mocking smile on the master's face gradually disappeared, and he said in a low voice, "It passed from my father's hands to my sister's hands, and your father, Nasri, sent the bracelet back to my niece. It can be considered to have returned to the hands of our family." Su Li's eyes slightly froze. He remembered the bracelet he saw on Jian Shuayer's jade wrist. The bracelet was engraved with ancient letters and lyrics. He was shocked to find that the important star map, which had never appeared in historical records and was only silently sought by big shots at the level of military god Li Pifu and Lady Tai, had always been in Jian Shui'er's hands. But there was something wrong with this matter. If the bracelet that hid the star map was passed down by Master Fan of the Imperium, why was it engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? After hesitating for a moment, he raised his question to the beautiful middle-aged man in the smoke. Why is the ancestral bracelet of Master Fan of the Imperium engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? The great teacher laughed cheerfully. The air he exhaled dispersed the smoke in front of him. The thin coat on his body fluttered uneasily. He raised his leg and stepped on the stool beside him. He praised himself and said, "This is also what I have always wanted to prove." Master Fan stared into Su Li's eyes and said with a charming smile, "At the very beginning, there was no Federation, and there was no Imperium. Both sides came from the same place in the universe, and I have to narcissistically come to a conclusion that our family should occupy a very important place in this period of history." The inference was not complicated, and the conclusion was not narcissistic. Instead, it was very logical. However, there was no shock on Su Li's face. Instead, there was some indifference. He shook his head and said, "Many historians in the Federation are doing research in this area, but in front of the flames of war, this kind of experiment is not very meaningful. Because my ground is higher, the Imperium has to believe what I say," the great teacher said calmly. Su Lu silently agreed with the great teacher's statement. There is a great calamity in the history of the Federation, but what is a great calamity? Have you ever dug up a prehistoric relic underground? Master Fan waved his arm and said disdainfully, "Only you poor mechanical citizens brainwashed by broken computers would not conduct in-depth research on these matters. What do you mean by not very meaningful? I have evidence to prove that both sides are relatives. That is enough." The Federation's current research also believes that the Great Calamity is a disaster for the prehistoric civilization. This point coincides with your thoughts. Sulu looked at the excited great teacher and said with a shrug, "All right, the Imperium might be a branch of that prehistoric civilization, and our families might be relatives. But where is your evidence? Is the bracelet on my beautiful niece's wrist not evidence? First, you have to show evidence that she is your niece. Look at this face of mine." Master Fan raised his head and forced his face, which could be described as peerlessly beautiful, to come before Su Li's face. Think about Jian Shui'er's face. Where can you find such excellent genes? That does make some sense, Su Lu said with a shrug again. But don't forget that your princess is not very beautiful. There's still a lot of evidence and numerical units. How can there be the same astronomical units and dating methods that are so outrageous in different universes? Be it the Federation or the Imperium, as long as the big shots in power are willing, they can start a comparison work that involves all aspects of human society, Master Fan said sarcastically. Master Fan said mockingly, "It's a pity that what should have been the warmest and most exciting reunion in the history of mankind was directly turned into countless massacres by those greedy mineral merchants of the Federation." The middle-aged man opposite him looked like a licentious playboy, but after all, he was the most mysterious and honorable great teacher in the Imperium. Whether it was his psychological inclination or his position, of course, he was on the Imperium's side. Sula had no intention of refuting his ridicule. Why am I so interested in Schiller? Not only because his popular novels in the middle period of his life seemed to me to be the best way for humans to pass the time and survive the hardships of life, but also because I feel that from his works, I can clearly see the similarities between the Imperium and the Federation. There is no one in this world, no one with a brain that can come up with so many plots that require different life experiences, insights, and even extreme insights to write. According to my request, the Imperial Intelligence Agency collected a large amount of Schiller's works. The more I read, the more I feel that the person who can write so many scripts and novels can't be the same person. Sula listened to him in silence, feeling a little strange. Regarding this question that had troubled the Federation's Literature Research Institute and the folk celebrity gossip fans for countless years, he suddenly thought of something. Could it be that Schiller really did not exist, and was not a sock puppet of one of the five, but was it written by an old thing? Schiller is not the same person. Great teacher Fan raised his head slightly, his gaze passing through the smoke and the black cloth to look at the white courtyard outside, the green trees, and the high sky. Or rather, those books were not written by the same person. He was just a narrator. Sulu was still silent. He originally thought that tonight's visit to the great teacher Fan Manor was ridiculous. But after the conversation, he realized that the owner of this white courtyard was indeed not an ordinary person. Shouldn't you put down your gun? Although we are not related by blood, you still have to call me uncle. The great teacher suddenly changed the topic. What kind of uncle is this? Sulu thought silently in his heart. However, in the Imperium, it was not a bad thing to have such an influential uncle. His father, who had died in a mining accident, seemed to have benefited him greatly. He only hoped that his mother and sister in the underworld would not mind that he had randomly recognized a relative. He put down his gun. This makes me feel much better. I can continue talking about my research over the years. Great teacher Fan looked at him with an amiable smile and said, "My hobby since childhood has been literature. After obtaining 6 bachelor's degrees from the Imperial University, I finally chose to focus my life on comparative literature research. Comparative literature research between the Federation and the Empire. Yes, I'm the only one in this department. From the head of the department to the lecturers to the students, I am the only one. I believe that in the entire universe, I am the only one in this field. It is absolutely unique." The middle-aged man smiled very proudly. Every generation's great teacher was a stunning talent, a figure who was close to a god in their own field. Sula had long acknowledged this fact, but he really did not expect that this generation's great teacher Fan seemed to be a youth, a middle-aged man, or perhaps an old man who was intoxicated by literature. I have written countless unpublished papers to prove that Schiller's novel scripts have many texts that are too similar to each other. In the form of folklore, they're circulated within the Imperium. To prove that 2 societies came from the same civilization, what kind of similarity is the most important? That is the similarity of cultures. Great teacher Fan pursed his lips and raised both of his hands as he spoke loudly. His thin jacket slid down his arms and piled up to his shoulders. Paired with his bare legs, he looked like a fanatical religious priest. According to the distant and almost blurred legends, although my ancestor was the biggest war oligarch, he was also the person who hated war the most. I'm also the same. My hobby is literature, peace, and love. So please allow me to temporarily imprison you in the name of literature, peace, and love, the most precious things in my life." As his voice fell, the gradually dissipating smoke dissipated even faster. Su Li's pupils suddenly constricted. His right hand that was still holding the gun vigilantly was just about to raise when several thick bolts of blue lightning broke through the smoke and struck his chest fiercely. This chapter is okay. I like the image of the very loving and beautiful master with bare thighs and a bit of a hippie. Also, my book friend Lil 9 gave me a wedding gift. This is the first gift I received. I am very grateful, but that book is actually 100 Years of Solitude. In this remnant thought. Chapter 626. The electric arc struck Su Li's chest, and the powerful impact instantly caused his knees to soften, causing him to fall to the ground. At the same time, an irresistible numbness surged and occupied every muscle fiber in his body, causing his body to tremble violently. He could no longer raise his right arm that was holding the gun, and the index finger that was pressing on the trigger was twitching violently. A crisp gunshot rang out, instantly breaking the silence of the night sky of the great Master Fan Manor. At the same time, the pistol fell to the ground powerlessly. If it were the old Sulu, he definitely wouldn't have any ability to move after being struck by such a powerful electric current. However, at the cost of his meridians shattering and using death as a bet, Sulu forcefully recovered the true chi in his body. Su Li's realm had received some kind of strong increase, faintly entering into another realm. He didn't completely collapse. His knee heavily smashed onto the stone floor, creating a shattering sound that would make one's heart tremble. It was unknown whether it was the stone or the knee that had shattered. Su Li's suddenly bright eyes were filled with disbelief and anger. A scorching current surged violently behind his waist, resisting the invasion of the electric current with great difficulty. It was almost impossible for him to raise his right arm and point his finger at the great teacher's beautiful face that was filled with boundless excitement. There was still half a meter between his finger and that face, and there was only air between them. However, the great teacher's pupils suddenly shrank, and he squeezed out a scream of panic from his lips. With a kick of his feet, his entire body flipped over in an extremely sorry state. With a chi sound, an invisible force shot out from Su Li's fingertip, slicing through the air and arriving before the great teacher in an instant. The sharp force cut through the thin coat that was fluttering in the air. The great teacher, who was crying out in a strange manner, staggered and fell to the ground. His right hand drew a strange arc in the air and formed a hollow shield in front of his body. With a muffled bang, the hollow fist seemed to have grasped an invisible force, shattering upon contact, causing a few wisps of smoke and dust to fly up from nowhere. The electric arcs that shot out from the walls of the room continued to attack Su Li's body. He looked at the other party with grief and indignation, and his body trembled violently a few times before finally falling heavily to the ground, unable to get up again. Master Fan slowly opened his right hand and looked at the edge of his palm that had been shocked red with a pale face. He had not expected that Su Lu, who had been hit by several military electric currents, would still have the ability to fight back. With lingering fear, he silently sighed with emotion. The bloodline that his father had excavated in the Federation back then did indeed have incomparably strong genes. He lowered his head and looked at the tear in his clothes. He couldn't help but pat his chest to comfort himself. Then he lifted the lower edge of his wide and thin coat with both hands. His bare thighs bounced up in a dazzling manner, breaking through who knows how many layers of black cloth in front of him. He rushed into the white courtyard and shouted, "Everyone come out. The first thing is done. The next thing is tomorrow. Remember to double the thickness of the steel plate." The white-haired housekeeper walked out of the darkness with a frown on his face. He bowed and said, "Master, although the palace is used to your running amok, isn't this a bit too big of a commotion? Also, will we, the ones who do the actual work, be hanged? With me around, who dares to touch you?" Master Fan tugged at the hem of his thin coat and said proudly, "Remember, you are participating in the occurrence of a major historical event." "Fine." The old housekeeper raised his hands helplessly. Thinking of his master's earlier orders, he said awkwardly, "The alloy prison cell has been prepared for a long time. There is no need to temporarily thicken the steel plate, right? If it is any thicker, then it won't look like a room anymore. It will look like a large piece of metal." Master Fan sighed and turned his head to look at Su Lu, who was being dragged out by the servants. He looked at the unconscious youth's face, full of anger and unwillingness. He smiled bitterly and said, "The young people these days are much more powerful than our generation. If we don't double the thickness, I won't be able to feel at ease." "Why?" Su Lu rubbed his red and swollen palm and glanced angrily at the alloy wall with faint palm marks. He confirmed that with his own strength, there was no way he could destroy this room. Who knew how much alloy that evil and sinister fellow had used to create such a thick wall? For literature, peace, and love. The great teacher's voice rang out, sounding particularly righteous. "You can stay here in peace until the end of the war. That would be for the best." "Why?" he shouted in grief and indignation. After confirming that the great teacher did not seem to want to kill him or hand him over to the Empire's royal family, Su Lu became more and more confused. They had just been reuniting with each other, discussing their relationship, and thinking of a way to leave the Empire. Why did the great teacher suddenly turn hostile and lock him up? "Don't worry, I'm not a schemer. The reason why I could guess that you would come and have a way to imprison you is because I've read too many books. I know that the Federation has a saying with the same meaning. There is nothing new under the sun. I've read too many books, experienced countless lives, and experienced countless complicated stories. So I can guess what you want to do. I also know what you should do. After a moment of silence, the great teacher smiled and said, "Everyone has their own historical mission. Student Sulu, have you ever thought about what your historical mission is?" The words were very calm, but when they landed in Su Li's ears, he felt that the great teacher's voice had a hint of frenzy and excitement. He looked helplessly at the alloy walls around him. It was futile. The Empire's control of planet Tianjing continued. Any family that dared to violate the ban and allow flying vehicles to enter the atmosphere would face the most vicious attacks. The outer space of the planet was filled with the silhouettes of battleships. Countless battleships were withdrawn from various star regions and distributed to a few large space bases in the star system. Huai Chaoshi walked on the grassy path of the Imperial Palace. She raised her head and narrowed her eyes to look at the clear and white sky. It was early in the morning, and the heat of late spring and early summer had yet to arrive. The air was extremely cool, but her mood was not like that. The Federation's fleet had already entered the Empire's star region. Although they were still extremely far away from planet Tianjing, although the Federation had never attacked planet Tianjing, although the Emperor had already drafted the strategic plan of exchanging space for time, as the successor of the Empire and the god in the hearts of the soldiers, a heavy sense of responsibility and urgent anxiety had already pressed down on her shoulders. Her personal battleship had already been prepared for an expedition. Tonight, she would embark on a space journey to the battlefield. However, a few months had already passed, and that person had still not been caught. This was like a thorn that pierced deeply into her heart, casting a layer of strange and indescribable color on this unknown expedition. Your Highness, according to your wise instructions, tens of thousands of colleagues from 4 departments have worked tirelessly to investigate the mechanical equipment and household electronic devices that have appeared in the market in the past few months. Finally, we found a few target devices. These devices all have some modifications that do not conform to the common electronic standards of the Empire. One of them is a pirated video player that is currently selling like hotcakes. Huai Chaoshi walked out of the underground palace expressionlessly. Listening to the report of this subordinate of the Intelligence Bureau beside her, she knew that this fellow was probably not used to pleasing nobles. She did not care about the detestable parts of his words and only listened attentively. Check it out. After saying this, she sat in the military vehicle and thought silently for a long time. Suddenly, she opened her mouth and asked, "What time is it in Rio?" 9 o'clock. It's almost time. It was extremely rare for Huai Chaoshi to frown slightly, revealing a troubled and even slightly fearful expression. Sulu was on the run in the Empire alone and could actually escape for several months at a time. The chip monitoring system that covered all the streets and alleys could not find a trace of him at all. Huai Chaoshi directly deduced that Su Lu was able to do this without a doubt because of that amazing Nasri. And to know how Nasri did all this back then, there was probably only one place in the entire universe that could give the answer, and that was Master Fan Manor. However, Huai Chaoshi did not want to go Master Fan Manor. Although the beautiful and almost demonic old man inside was her closest uncle, she still did not want to go. In this universe, the only one Huai Chaoshi respected was her father, and the only one she was willing to admit as her opponent was the Federation's war godly Pifu. However, the only one she was wary of, and even a little fearful of, was that Master Fan uncle. This was because she thought that this uncle was sick, very sick, the kind that read too many books and often did not act according to common sense. He was so crazy that it made people scratch their heads in confusion. Not to mention the relationship between generations. The Baijin royal family had always worshipped Master Fan Manor as some kind of transcendental existence, according to the blood oath of the distant past. Towards Master Fan's madness, she could not hit or scold him, so she could only be wary and fearful, and had the impulse to avoid him at all costs. However, she had to leave at night, and she would not be satisfied if she did not catch Sulu, so she could only muster up her courage and enter that white courtyard. Master Fan Manor. Huai Chaoshi sat by the table, holding a teacup and sipping small mouthfuls. Her eyes scanned the surroundings vigilantly, worried that she would see her uncle run naked into the rain and shout for joy again. Fortunately, it was not raining today, but on that sunny day 10 years ago, he seemed to have run naked once. She furrowed her brows and suddenly turned around. Her short hair fluttered and a cold and ruthless expression suddenly appeared in her eyes. The heavy alloy door closed silently behind her, and the room was now a prison cell. "Uncle, what are you up to again?" Huai Chaoshi suppressed her anger and slammed the teacup on the table. She shouted at the surveillance equipment installed somewhere. "I'm going to war tonight, and I do not want to be forced to listen to some Schiller script test by you." After a long silence, the great teacher's complacent laughter came from outside the room. "My dear niece, I did not expect that imprisoning you would be so much easier than catching Su Lu." "You caught Su Lu?" Huai Chaoshi frowned. "But why do you want to imprison me?" Chapter 6:27. What are you up to now? Huai Chaoshi's brows furrowed tightly as she listened to the voice that came from somewhere in the dark room. She was at a loss as she forced out a cold voice from between her teeth. Her Highness, who had always been calm, confident, and proud, did not notice that she had repeated two meaningless sentences in such a short amount of time. Master Fan, who was standing outside the room with his thighs bared and proud of himself, ignored her and left while humming a tune. She did not know where he went. Huai Chaoshi felt as if a bullet had been fired, but it had landed on a pile of mindless cow dung. Her expression became extremely ugly, and after a moment of silence, she walked towards the wall on her left. She took a deep breath, and the thin body under her military uniform trembled slightly. With a light snort, she slammed her arm into the wall like a heavy hammer. Smoke and dust rose, and the dust fell, revealing the cold and threatening alloy inner wall and the faint imprint of a palm. Huai Chaoshi frowned as she looked at the wall in shock. She gently rubbed her wrist and wondered how thick the wall was built by the madman. She had hit it with all her might, but it did not break the wall. The building did not even tremble. She was about to embark on the journey to resist the federal army at night. She did not have the time to wait for that madman to calm down. In fact, in this absurd predicament and the fact that she was imprisoned on Tianjing, Her Highness had forgotten how to write the word calm. The heavy dust remover easily lifted her slender wrist and slammed her against the door. She grabbed the hard modern-style metal flower stand and violently smashed it against the wall again and again. The entire room was filled with flying debris like a hail of bullets and terrifying loud noises that rang out from time to time. Master Fan was lying on a chair in the white courtyard outside the specially made prison room. His bare thighs were spread wide open as he drooled over the armrest. He held a teapot in his hand as he listened to the sounds coming from the room and looked at the smoke and dust coming out from the alloy wall. He said angrily, "Did you see that? I told you that the young people nowadays are too vigorous and too beastly. I told you to double the thickness, but you didn't believe me. If the alloy thickness is still the original plan, not to mention my niece, this terrifying female monster, I'm afraid that even Su Lu won't be able to contain her. But it's not a good idea to keep smashing it like this. Firstly, it feels a little dangerous. Secondly, such a loud noise will attract some people's attention," the white-haired old butler said respectfully. "That's true." Master Fan retracted his leg and thought for a moment. He put down his teacup, lit a cigarette, and said leisurely, "Turn on high voltage for me. Also, tell the people inside to avoid any accidents." In the gloomy room, Huai Chaoshi was still silently throwing a tantrum. All the objects in the room that could cause damage to the walls had all become weapons in her hands. She valiantly slammed them against the alloy wall. Then, like waves crashing against a black reef, they turned into white foam and scattered everywhere. Just as she was about to grab the last set of pear-wood table and chair in the room, a tired and helpless voice suddenly sounded from the dark corner of the room. "Don't smash it. According to my judgment, We may have to rely on this set of table and chair to eat prisoners' meals for a few days. White Saoshir's fingers that touched the surface of the smooth wooden table slightly stiffened. She narrowed her eyes and looked over. Looking at the guy squatting in the corner like a distressed beggar, she remembered that Master Fan had said that he had caught this person. The room was very quiet. Su Lu slowly stood up along the wall. His face was a little haggard, and his dyed brown hair was a little withered yellow. He looked like he had just recovered from a serious illness, but also like he had been starved for countless days. For some reason, seeing that the other person was also inexplicably imprisoned here, White Saoshir's mood calmed down a lot. She felt a lot more balanced, and her narrowed eyes gradually relaxed. The two of them didn't speak. They silently looked at each other in the room for a long time. The pursuer and the one being chased on the road of escape had to accept the fact that they were now both prisoners and locked up together. "Hello." Su Lu was the first to break the silence, forcing a smile. Huai Chaoshir lowered her chin slightly and replied, "Hello, long time no see." It was a very simple, calm, and even plain greeting between two people in this kind of relationship. However, it was precisely because they were people with such temperaments that the absurdity was actually natural. Outside the prison, someone informed them that the wall had been connected to high-voltage electricity and asked His Highness and Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu to pay attention to their personal safety. After that, there was no more sound. Using a floating hair that was burned to ashes, Huai Chaoshir confirmed that Master Fan Manor wasn't lying. She stopped her actions of destroying the queen. According to her inference, since Su Lu couldn't escape, the possibility of her being able to break through the wall was not high. What kind of lock can't even be opened by you? Or did you forget to open the toolbox? Huai Chaoshir gently brushed the dust off her military uniform and sat in the chair to ask a very important question. After saying Shu Hai joined hands to escape, she had long confirmed that Su Lu had inherited and even surpassed Nasri's mechanical talent, so it was very difficult to believe that there was a lock in the world that could stop him. "I'm prepared. I brought the most commonly used tools and equipment." Su Lu sat down on the other side of the table and narrowed his eyes at the alloy door not far in front of him. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "It's just that the lock used for this alloy door is a large alloy rod." "You mean the most primitive kind of door lock?" Huai Chaoshir asked with confusion. "Correct. The mechanical education I received since I was young is that the most primitive tools built according to the simplest laws of physics are the least likely to break. The tools mentioned here also include locks." Time ticked by. The two of them sat across from each other at the table, not saying a word. The soft light above their heads shone down. They didn't know how much the sun outside the room had shifted. They didn't know what the person on the other side of the table would do next. They also didn't know how long it would take for this dark and strange situation to end. Even now, these two most powerful experts of the younger generation still didn't understand how and why the great teacher had captured them. A plate of fruit and a few glasses of water appeared on the transmission table on the alloy wall. Su Lu saw that Huai Saoshir's face was gloomy and didn't seem to have any intention of doing anything. He sighed in his heart and took them and placed them on the table. At this time, an ultra-thin scroll of light unfolded on the wall. A voice that sounded particularly crazy at this time appeared in front of the two of them together with a pair of white legs. Without waiting for the great teacher outside the room to speak, Huai Chaoshir suddenly stood up and said angrily and gloomily, "My subordinates are still waiting outside the mansion. Everyone knows that I'm here. I don't care what's wrong with you and why you've locked me up, but you can't keep me locked up forever, otherwise what?" On the screen, the great teacher's charming face flashed with a trace of embarrassment and anger. He shouted loudly, "I indeed forgot about this problem, but can I keep you locked up forever? Don't forget that this is the great teacher Fan Manor. Don't forget the blood oath. Without my permission, who the F***CK dares to barge in? For more than 700 years, not a single emperor has dared to break this rule. Do you think your father dares?" Su Lu, who had been carefully guarding against Huai Saoshir's sudden rage, quietly listened to the conversation between her and the great teacher Fan. Although he didn't know what the blood oath was, he could roughly guess that it was some kind of agreement between the great teacher Fan Manor and the imperial family. Knowing that the imperial family didn't dare to casually enter the great teacher Fan Manor, although he was also one of the prisoners, he still calmed down a little. Then he thought about how the great teacher Fan Manor had said that for more than 700 years, not a single emperor had dared to enter the great teacher Fan Manor without permission, but he just happened to enter last night. It could be said that he was extremely daring, and he couldn't help but feel a little proud. CK, back then, my sister wanted to divorce him, but he refused. Did he think that this daddy wouldn't dare to take revenge? The great teacher on the screen thumped his chest loudly. Huai Chaoshi painfully held her forehead, clenching her left fist. She helplessly said, "How could the Holy Emperor allow a divorce? Besides, this is already something from countless years ago. Why do you still hold a grudge? This is a matter between husband and wife, and even a daughter like me can't do anything about it. Don't tell me you want to take revenge on the Empire over this matter. I implore you to quickly wake up. I still have to hurry to the front lines." The great teacher Fan ignored her stern questioning. After taking a deep breath, he said with an incomparable intoxication, "Front lines? War? No, before this war is over, don't even think about leaving this specially made prison cell." "Why?" Huai Chaoshi and Sulu asked at the same time. Then, they looked at each other, narrowed their eyes, and turned their heads. "Sulu, if you go back and the people of the Federation know that you're still alive, that Mr. President who loves you to the bone will definitely mold you into a godlike hero. The technical supervisor who originally enjoyed the treatment of a division commander will definitely be promoted to the commander of the new 17th Division. The new 17th Division of the Federation has already landed on the administrative planet of the Prune County Star System. It is the main assault force of this war zone. To become the commander of the Federation's main division at such a young age, besides Li Pifu, who else has done this? If Su Lu could successfully escape from the Empire and return to the Federation, or perhaps return to the Federal forces, then what the great teacher said might happen. But when he heard these words, he didn't feel the slightest bit of satisfaction, only heaviness and anxiety. His comrades had already attacked the Empire's borders, and Old White and the brothers of Group 7 were fighting with their lives on the bloody battlefield, but he had no way of fighting alongside them. Huai Chaoshi had long known about this battlefield intelligence, so she didn't have much of a reaction. "And Your Highness, you are the god of the imperial armies. The morale of the soldiers and your personal strength are unparalleled in the world. This time, you will lead 500 Wolf Fong mecha to form a new mecha column and head to the war zone. You will definitely illuminate the heavens and spread your might far and wide." Only now did Su Lu know that this noble princess beside him was actually going to put herself in danger and head to the battlefield to fight. He silently thought that the people of the Empire had always been used to forming full mecha tactical units, but the Federation had only gradually changed their tactical concepts after the successful development of the MX 2 years ago. It was completely conceivable that Huai Chaoshi, with her terrifying combat ability, and a group of beast-like Wolf Fong mecha would bring heavy casualties to the federal forces on the planet's surface. Unless Madman Li faced her directly, there would be only a sliver of a chance. But what's more important for you two youngsters is not your role on the battlefield, but your status in your respective countries and the influence you may have on this universe in the future. Su Lu, who had been silent for a long time, finally opened his mouth and said, "I'm very afraid that you would compare me with the princess of your country, but I hope you can get to the point. I hate war. My family hates war the most. I love literature, peace, and love." Grandmaster Fan raised both of his hands in excitement on the screen and said loudly, "If I can lock up the two most dangerous enemies in the universe, who will definitely have the most important positions in the future, and make them friends, then this war that is destined to last for many years will definitely be greatly reduced in cruelty and even peace." Naive mental patient. Su Li's expression was blank from shock, and he subconsciously said softly, "Crazy immature child." Huai Chaoshi was still holding her forehead in pain as she cursed in a low voice. "I'm not naive, and I'm not crazy. Grandmaster Fan stared at the camera very seriously and said, if you two die in this war, or become truly irreconcilable enemies of life and death, this matter will really be very difficult to resolve, so I have to do my best to keep you alive and get along peacefully. Your peace, perhaps in the distant future, will be the peace of the universe. Hearing this, Huai Chaoshi put down her hand that was covering her forehead. The flames in her narrowed eyes seemed to want to burn down everything in the world. She stared at the familiar and crazy face on the screen, and her tone was extremely cold. She said coldly, don't forget, you are a citizen of the Empire. You imprison me here, and what will happen to the war on the front lines if you lose? The history of the Empire should not pay the price of your insanity with blood. We are not citizens of the Empire, Grandmaster Fan calmly replied outside the room. From the moment you came here, you are citizens of the Empire, Huai Chaoshi coldly rebuked. Don't forget that your blood and the blood of the royal family have long been inseparably mixed together. I have the blood of Grand Master Fan's family in me, but your mother is also a member of the royal family. That's right. Grandmaster Fan was silent for a long time before he said, living here, I am a citizen of this place, and am a citizen of the Empire, but His Majesty and you should both know that the comprehensive strength of the Empire and the Federation is too different. Even if we use the vast universe as a strategic space to retreat in exchange for a chance to breathe, how far can we retreat? In the end, the Empire will not be able to win this war. It has been decades. When has the Federation's invasion not been repelled by us? Huai Chaoshi raised her clear eyebrows slightly and replied slowly and with great strength. The Federation has never fought a war before, so their army was a pile of shit at the beginning. However, the war has trained them. The federal forces that have passed through the space channel have become stronger each time. In fact, in the last war, Li Pifu and his disciples had already seized the absolute victory. Grandmaster Fan's expression gradually turned desolate as he said faintly, now that Nasri is dead, who can go to the headquarters of the federal forces and cause a huge explosion? Huai Caoshi's eyelids drooped slightly and then lifted up. They were inexplicably bright. She said calmly and confidently, me? You can't. Grandmaster Fan said firmly, because you are not a citizen of the Federation. You're not Li Pifu's brother. You are not him. Huai Chaoshi was silent. Sulu was also silent. He was somewhat unsettled by the mention of the uncle's name and the huge explosion. Was the Federation's failure last time really because of the uncle's betrayal? Time passed bit by bit, just like the dew on the glass on the surface of the pear-wood table slid down slowly and disappeared into the wood grain. The Grand Master on the light screen got rid of his previous desolate expression. With a hint of a playful smile, he said, if you can't be friends, then get married. This sentence was like a chain of thunder, hitting Su Lu and Huai Chaoshi so hard that they raised their heads in shock. They looked at each other speechlessly, and 2 lines of tears silently flowed down from their hearts. Sulu, you should have read Schiller's crazy, infatuating ancient knight novel. You should know that everything in the world is like a shadow woven from bubbles. Only love is real. Xiaoshi is a little older than you, but there is no problem with an older sister falling in love with a younger brother. As a loyal fan and the best researcher of Schiller's plays, I think you should know that since Jian Shui'er is your sister, your best choice is her. Of course, Xiaoshi is not as pretty as her sister, but I think this L will give you plenty of time to cultivate your feelings. Xiaoshi, seriously and without prejudice, think about my suggestion. Sacrifice your love to save the entire universe. After saying this, the light screen slowly pulled up. The Grand Master once again floated away, leaving this secluded space to the young man and woman with strange expressions. Just now, he said that I'm not as pretty as my sister. Who is this sister he's referring to? To Su Li's surprise, Huai Chaoshi did not angrily pick up the pear-wood table and launch the most terrifying attack in the universe. Instead, she sat quietly on the chair and asked such a question. According to him, Jian Shui'er is your half-sister from the same mother but different fathers. That is to say, Jian Shuai is Nasri's daughter and your half-sister. Sulu shrugged. He did not want to admit it, but he also did not want to clear up this troublesome relationship again. He was surprised to find that Huai Chaoshi could actually immediately determine who Jian Shuai's father was. It seemed that the affair between the Empress and the uncle was not an absolute secret that no one knew. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and asked him, "What is this eightfold symphony?" Sulu woke up and thought of a famous boring plot in Schiller's night novel. Looking at the cell that was very similar to the plot and Her Highness across the table in a neat military uniform, he was immediately dumbfounded. He sucked in a breath of cold air and cursed. What a F***king lunatic. He has always been a lunatic. Huai Chaoshi said expressionlessly. Sulu looked at her delicate facial features, and his fingers trembled slightly. He thought to himself, if you've seen Schiller's Eightfold Symphony, you definitely won't be as relaxed as you are now. He warned with extreme seriousness, don't eat fruits, don't drink water. Chapter 628. After learning the brief content of Schiller's play from Sulu, the cold flames in Huai Chaoshi's eyes burned brighter and brighter, as if they wanted to melt all the ice mountains that had accumulated for thousands of years into blue flames. But strangely, she didn't turn her anger into any concrete action. Instead, she sat silently on the chair. After a long, suffocating silence, she suddenly took off her military cap, rubbed her slightly curly black hair, and wiped off a few drops of sweat from her forehead. She looked forward and narrowed her eyes, asking, imprisoning us in a room and using an aphrodisiac, does that mean that in the eyes of that lunatic, I don't have the charm of a woman at all? Sulu slowly and strenuously turned his head to look at her delicate side profile. He was so shocked that he couldn't speak for a moment. He never thought that the powerful Princess Huai Chaoshi was seriously thinking about the content of the aphrodisiac instead of how to escape. George Carlin once wrote a famous joke with a sarcastic tone. Even if a woman is on the battlefield, when faced with the whistling missiles, she is most likely most concerned about whether the outline of her eyebrows is beautiful or not. But the powerful princess actually had a similar reaction at this moment. Sulu couldn't help but be shocked. It seemed that no matter how powerful a woman was, she was still a woman. And women, this wonderful creature, must have come from another parallel universe. He would never be able to understand it in his life. If you weren't always expressionless, hiding your face under the shadow of the military cap, I think anyone would have to admit that you would at least be considered delicate. Sulu didn't explain that the aphrodisiac had nothing to do with her feminine charm. It was purely because it was a classic scene in Schiller's play. The great teacher, a middle-aged fanatic for literature, would definitely design it according to the original. He paused for a long time and said sincerely, "But the problem is, it's really hard for me to see you as a woman." "I understand." Huai Chaoshi put the military cap on the table and replied expressionlessly, "It's hard for men to see me as a woman because they are more like weak women in front of me." This was true. In a vast universe, it was hard to find a male animal who could look down on you and was qualified to protect you. Sulu silently thought to himself, and then he recalled that Shang Qiu had once said something similar. Only now did he realize that all the women who had appeared in his life were actually such fierce and powerful existences. Time passed steadily and monotonously. Outside the prison cell, it should have already entered the night. In this long night, there was no food, no water, no television, and no internet to pass the time. There were only two young men and women who had no feelings for each other. In this awkward environment, the speed of time passing unconsciously slowed down. "What kind of man do you like?" Sulu got up and left the shallow pear blossom chair. He walked to the bottom of the scroll-like light screen and looked up. He asked casually, just like those adolescent girls who were hugging a pillow and hiding in bed, asking their best female friends. "Me? I never thought about it." Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and stared at Su Li's back. As a woman, she must have thought about this question. Sulu didn't turn around and said to himself, White Saoshir's previous performance already showed that her heart wasn't a biological pervert. Then, she must have a psychological process that a normal girl should have. They were both soldiers who were in a state of absolute hostility. There were no feelings between men and women at all. However, after several battles and escaping in the sea of mulberry trees, it was inevitable that there would be some feelings of sympathy. In their respective life domains, there were very few equally powerful existences. Therefore, Huai Chaoshir used indifference and calmness to hide the pride and loneliness of an expert in her heart. Su Lu used silence and cheerful smile to hide the inhuman feelings that had once appeared in his heart. Especially for Huai Chaoshir, there had never been someone who dared to probe into her private matters like Su Lu. There had never been someone who had the qualifications to have an equal conversation with her. After a long period of silence, Huai Chaoshir narrowed her eyes and replied, "When I was young, I seemed to like the palace music teacher. He had a pair of blue eyes, very white skin, and a tall and thin figure. It was as if he would be blown away by the wind." Could it be that the biological process of love in this princess body was a simple compliment? Su Li's lips moved, and he almost laughed out loud. He never would have thought that the powerful and terrifying genius Huai Chaoshir would actually like this kind of pale, artistic youth. Of course, you can't be like that guy outside who has the hobby of running around naked, and you can't be as crazy as him. Huai Chaoshir's eyebrows were tightly knitted as she quickly added. Su Lu took out the tool he carried with him and inserted it into some kind of spring in the alloy wall. He gently twisted it and casually asked, "What happened to that music teacher later?" There was no later. Huai Chaoshir returned to her usual expression and coldly replied, "There is also no story that you Federation people want to hear the most. He should still be alive and well right now." Su Lu shrugged. He had already guessed this ending. A young princess falling in love with her own music teacher was indeed a very common scene. However, since that music teacher had a pair of blue eyes like the sea, he was definitely not a noble, let alone a member of the royal family. Naturally, this story had no later. "What are you doing?" Huai Chaoshir watched him pry open the alloy wall and frowned in confusion. "I'm making that light screen unable to work. In Schiller's play, the trapped male lead blocks the stone hole, thus making the evil person with the hobby of voyeurism unable to endure and find a way to escape." Su Lu carefully moved the tool in his hand to avoid triggering the high voltage installed in the wall. He explained, "You can think that I'm playing along with that crazy music teacher, but I think this is indeed effective. At least we won't be disturbed." He walked back to the table and sat down. He lowered his head and organized the tools in the box. Suddenly, he thought of something and shook his head. "I think I'm wrong. He's your uncle, so he shouldn't have such a perverted hobby. Besides, we're not related by blood. Even if he is a pervert among perverts, it's meaningless." Huai Chaoshir did not reply. The two of them sat on opposite sides of the pale pear blossom table and began to be silent again. One was the princess of the empire. The other was the hero of the Federation. It was not easy for them to chat in such an environment without risking their lives. However, it was impossible for them to become true friends through conversation according to the great teacher's naive idea. How could they not be enemies when they loved each other on opposite sides of the river of hatred? It should be early in the still dark morning. The two people in the cell sat in silence for a night with helpless emotions. No matter who it was, they all had extraordinary abilities and extraordinary mobility that ordinary people could not hope to achieve. However, that master only used the simplest method to trap the two of them in a death trap. "I'm really stupid, really." Huai Chaoshir, whose short hair was messy, suddenly broke the silence. She looked at Su Lu with narrowed eyes and said with a smile, "I actually forgot the simplest method to solve this problem." Su Li's eyes also narrowed because he sensed great danger from Huai Chaoshir's smile. "The reason the lunatic outside imprisoned us is very simple. He needs me to be close to you," Huai Chaoshir said concisely. "If I kill you, there will be no reason for this crazy thing to continue. I will naturally be able to leave." Chapter 630. Sulu stared at her clenched fist hanging by his waist. The muscles on his back contracted until he felt a burning pain. His mind was highly focused, but his reply did not stop at all. He said mockingly, "Idiot. That lunatic locked you and me up because he's just a mentally ill middle-aged artistic man trying to influence history and get rid of the delusion of war. If I die, he'll lock you up for life because the effect is the same as locking us up alive." With a loud thud, the only light pear blossom table in the room finally shattered into countless pieces. Huai Chaoshi stared at the large crater under her feet and the reflection of the cold alloy at the bottom of the crater. She clenched her fists tightly in anger. At this moment, she should have already boarded a battleship and left planet Tianjing, rushing towards the border star regions at the fastest speed possible to lead her most loyal Mecha Division subordinates to battle the Federation's army. However, she was now imprisoned by a lunatic and was unable to escape. Furthermore, she was forced to be locked up together with a great enemy of the Federation. What made her feel the most humiliated and furious was that her lunatic uncle had actually thought of such a disgusting and filthy idea. Because of one thought, countless thoughts were born. She clenched her fists tightly and stared at Su Lu with narrowed eyes, not listening to his analysis. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed, feeling the oppressive feeling in the cell that made it harder and harder to breathe. Facing a powerful opponent that was gradually approaching, although he was not completely fearless, he maintained his normal tone and expression, even calmer than usual. "There's only the two of us in this cell. If you kill me, you'll only have a cold corpse to keep you company. That won't be a good feeling," he suggested in a seemingly serious manner. "I've seen many corpses since I was very young," Huai Chaoping said indifferently as she raised her chin slightly and took a step forward. "But you don't have the experience of cleaning up corpses," Su Lu replied. "The current temperature is suitable for people to take a walk by the river, but it's not suitable for keeping corpses. Corpses will rot in a very short time." Have you seen a giant? That's when the internal organs of a corpse are inflated after they rot." He gestured a certain distance with his hands and said seriously, "When the time comes, my leg will be swollen like this. The veins on it will be exposed, and the black and smelly blood will flow everywhere." Huai Chaoshi waved her hand to stop him from explaining in detail. With a hint of mockery, she replied, "Do you think I'm one of those noble ladies who run in the foggy forest holding up their skirts and screaming when they see little rabbits?" After a moment of silence, Su Lu said, "No, it's just that based on our interactions these days, I'm sure you have misophobia." Huai Caoshi's eyes narrowed even more. She stared at him for a long time without saying anything. She was like a powerful god whose halo had suddenly been dispelled, revealing her most fatal weakness. "If I kill you, even if my uncle continues to lock me up, I think he will take your body away and burn it to ashes or feed it to the dogs." Her voice was still calm, but the meaning of her words was gradually becoming more and more vicious. It was probably because Su Lu had seen through her misophobia, which made her very angry. "If you haven't forgotten, I've just destroyed all the surveillance equipment in this room, leaving only a one-way light screen." Su Lu used 2 fingers to hold a few data cables and patiently tried to persuade her. "The surveillance is broken, but I still have to deliver food. If I don't take it, the outside will naturally know there's a problem." "What problem? We're on a hunger strike. I believe that the crazy great teacher has a very high judgment of our survival ability. He won't pay attention to us for a few days, and these few days are enough for my body to rot into a pile of rotten meat full of flies and maggots crawling everywhere." Su Li's narrowed eyes gradually relaxed, and a bright light appeared in his pupils. He smiled as he described the various filthy and tragic scenes after his death, but he didn't feel disgusted at all. "And I have to remind you, everyone knows your ability. As long as you're in the cell, who in the great teacher fan manner would dare to open the cell door and drag my body out?" By this time, this conversation about the speed of decomposition and the princess misophobia had been going on. Huai Chaoshi had already walked in front of Su Lu. The woman's face, which could be considered pretty, flashed with a coldness. A powerful and suffocating aura rushed out, seeming to make the thick alloy walls of the cell shake uneasily. Under this kind of violent pressure and the threat of death, Su Li's face finally turned slightly pale. Soon after, his incomparably tyrannical expression turned calm. His narrowed eyes became brighter, and his thin lips were tightly pursed. Whoosh! White Saoshir's expression was cold. She lowered her waist, raised her elbow, and smashed her right fist towards Su Li's face without any fancy moves. However, it was this simple punch that seemed to have smashed a hole in the air, a hollow. Endless gushing power followed this passage that had been created out of nothing and rushed towards Su Li's cheek. In an instant, a strong wind blew, blowing until the eyelashes on Su Li's single eyelid couldn't stop trembling. Su Li's right hand was also trembling. His entire body was trembling, but naturally it wasn't because of fear. White Saoshir's pupils violently constricted in the next moment, because she found that her powerful fist was blocked by a wall. It was a thick and solid wall that was constantly trembling and moving. Every time it trembled, it absorbed a little of her strength and weakened a little. That strange repulsive force made her feel a faint sense of fear for the first time in her life. The wall was Su Li's hands that were blocking in front of her face. His right hand twisted, sticking close to White Saoshir's right wrist, and then like a sharp blade, it slid over. Where the palm arrived, the military uniform on White Saoshir's right arm was peeled off piece by piece, and amidst sizzling noises, it turned into countless soft pieces of tattered cloth. White Saoshir's pupils constricted. She sensed that the palm contained a power that didn't seem to be inferior to her own, and endless doubts appeared in her heart. She didn't understand how this Federation man in front of her could become so much more powerful than before after disappearing for more than half a year. Right now, there was no time for this imperial princess who had never lost before to think. She narrowed her eyes, capturing that palm that was as fast as lightning in front of her. Her right shoulder suddenly pushed back, and instead of retreating, she pushed forward. Almost at the same time, her left hand formed a semicircle around her waist, and the knuckle of her middle finger fiercely and incomparably sharply smashed down towards the empty space in front of her. As expected, if her sharp strike didn't hit that point in the air, then Su Li's tyrannical palm blade would have quietly left her right arm in a semicircle and chopped at her neck. However, there were no ifs and there were no buts. Her sharp strike directly hit Su Li's originally unfathomable sneak attack and fiercely struck his wrist, emitting a bone-chilling sound of collision. Su Li had indeed successfully fooled her after pretending to be weak for such a long time, and he had found the best opportunity to launch a surprise attack. However, even under such a dangerous situation, her mind still didn't waver in the slightest. Just like how the spirits in the forest could smell the scent of smoke from 1,000 miles away, she could also smell the hidden danger from who knows where. Moreover, she didn't hesitate to smash down towards that most dangerous spot. Schemes and tricks, opportunistic techniques, they were all existences of nothingness in front of powerful strength. Difficult knots couldn't block the king's sword, and fatal dangers couldn't block the empire's princess's smash. The smash that seemed to be a gamble actually reflected White Saoshir's astonishing combat strength and experience. This could only be attributed to talent, just like the similar talents that Su Lu and Mad Manly had. No one could imitate or learn from them. The two most powerful young people in the Empire and the Federation were silently engaged in a life and death struggle in this strange prison cell. They were not like beasts, but more like machines. After missing her attack, White Saoshir unreasonably took another step forward. Her right hand moved like lightning along Su Li's left arm, and her thumb pressed down on the vital point below his ear. Her left arm turned into an iron rod, and with a gust of wind, she followed Su Li's palm and struck below his ribs. If this strike landed, who knew how many of Su Li's ribs would be broken? It was even more likely that the alveoli in his lungs would be shattered in an instant. However, After all, she was facing Su Lu, the Su Lu who had experienced the miserable experience of having all of his meridians shattered. Through his powerful willpower, he was resurrected and even improved. She was facing Su Lu, who also possessed talent that others couldn't hope to match. She was facing Su Lu, who, for the first time, fought with the mentality of a weakling in a head-on battle. Moreover, she was going against her nature and using countless words and expressions to confuse the enemy. Su Lu. The 10 stances that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him since he was young had long been integrated into his blood. His bones had become an inseparable part of his muscle memory. He had found an extremely rare opportunity, an opportunity that could possibly defeat the insufferably arrogant Huai Chaoshi. All of his spirit and strength were mobilized. All of his muscle fibers were crazily squeezing and rubbing together. He never thought that he could knock down Huai Chaoshi in one strike. He even predicted that Huai Chaoshi would be able to avoid his hidden second strike. As a result, his brain didn't go through this process at all. He directly relied on his intuition and instincts to suddenly raise his left knee and push it against the inside of his opponent's thigh. At the same time, his right arm that had just swung out horizontally behind his shoulder, avoiding his opponent's right arm and smashing towards Huai Chaoshi's forehead. Huai Chaoshi fell. This was the first time in her dazzling and undefeated battle career that she had fallen. In the final moment when life and death were about to be decided, or perhaps it was better to say in the instant when both of them perished together, her left arm forcefully shifted the angle of attack, smashing into the edge of Su Li's treacherous right knee. Then, she inconceivably raised her arm like lightning, blocking Su Li's right arm under her armpit. However, she couldn't stop her opponent's berserk strength, breaking who knew how many of her ribs that were of the same thickness as a normal person's. Her body fell heavily into the crater on the ground. The muffled sound shook up a few strands of inconspicuous dust. However, she immediately supported her body and maintained a sitting position. Blood seeped out from the corners of her lips. She stared at the Federation man not far away with unprecedented vigilance and killing intent. That Federation man also fell. From the looks of it, his injuries weren't any lighter than hers. However, for some reason, when Huai Chaoshi saw that fellow leaning against the wall and coughing out blood nonstop, she felt the true meaning of the word terrifying for the first time in her life. It wasn't just because he was already quite powerful to begin with. Now, he was even more powerful than before. Instead, it was because in this short and dangerous battle, this Federation man exuded a cold feeling of indifference towards life and death. Chapter 631. Sula stopped coughing. He coughed up blood, and he coughed up blood with a joyful smile. His back slammed heavily into the wall, shaking off the cement and plastic layer, revealing the cold alloy material underneath. He coughed up blood incessantly, clutching his aching lower abdomen that was about to go numb. He sat on the ground with his legs spread apart in an ungraceful manner, leaning against the wall. He stared at Huai Chaoshi in the pit, but there was no fear in his eyes. There was only boundless brightness, and within that brightness, there was an uncontrollable joy. He had expended a great deal of energy to set up this opportunity, and it had indeed seriously injured Huai Chaoshi. However, Huai Chaoshi's strength still exceeded his expectations. He never thought that at the last moment, Huai Chaoshi's left arm would actually be able to block his knee strike in such a short amount of time, and then clamp his fatal punch under her armpit. What he found most inconceivable was that when his right arm struck Huai Chaoshi's ribs, under that intense pain, the other party was actually strong enough to clamp down on his right arm for an instant. In that instant, when he lost control, Huai Chaoshi's leg, which had been nailed to the ground like a nail, lifted up and kicked him in the lower abdomen. He was also seriously injured, but so what? Huai Chaoshi, this combat genius who had shocked the universe in her adolescence, the Empire's military idol who had never lost, still fell in front of him, battered and exhausted as she fell into the pit that he had created. No matter how strong the enemy was, in the end, she was still only one person. Originally, her face would pale, she would vomit blood, and her ribs would break. Even the sound of breaking was no different from that of a normal person. Confirming this point was very meaningful to Sulu. It was a positive meaning that made him laugh. Actually, cough, cough, just now cough. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, breathed heavily a few times, and looked at the pale-faced Huai Chaosher in the pit. His eyes slightly narrowed, and said, "What I really wanted to say just now was, why did you kill me?" Sulu dared to face Madman Li, who was invincible in the Federation. Without blinking, dared to charge into the Medellin building with a bunch of guns, dared to single-handedly charge into the Empire's defense line to activate the glory of the Charter. There was no need to doubt his perseverance, courage, and the confidence that was deeply hidden under his ordinary appearance and the pride in his bones. Only this kind of person would chase after Zhong Sugu from the Federation to the Empire in a seemingly crazy manner and carry out that petty revenge from morning till night. When he and the Old Thing cooperated to kill the Empire's fleet and assassinate the Butcher Countess Chaosher, his life finally blossomed with the most dazzling brilliance in that instant. However, just like many of Schiller's tangled literary scripts, just as he was about to be a soul-stirring hero of the universe, abruptly ended in the hands of a peach miasma mecha and that powerful woman. Since then, facing that woman of the Empire, he could no longer find absolute and firm confidence, let alone the belief that he would definitely win. This kind of feeling was very bad. It was like his orgasm was forcefully interrupted, and before the flower bloomed, it wilted in pain. It was just like the feeling that kept coming from his lower abdomen. It wasn't until this moment that the powerful and terrifying Imperial Highness finally collapsed like an ordinary person that Sulu finally spat out the stuffy breath in her chest. She spat out that seemingly calm sentence, but in fact, it was filled with ruthlessness. "What right do you have to kill me? Do you have the ability to kill me? I always thought that I was open-minded enough to determine your combat ability, but today it seems that I still underestimated you." Huai Chaosher slowly wiped the blood dripping from the corner of her mouth, her voice slightly hoarse. "But do you really think that just because you opened your meridians and learned a little bit of true chi externalization, you could be my opponent?" Sulu frowned as he looked at his swollen abdomen. His thick eyebrows gradually knitted together. He subconsciously thought that if he dodged that kick a little slower, perhaps he would already be dead by now. Then his pupils violently shrank, because from the corner of his eyes he clearly saw that Huai Chaosher, who used her hand to support her tottering body a moment ago, was actually slowly standing up at this moment. He knew very well how many of her ribs were broken, and he also knew that the intense pain definitely couldn't be transferred by human will, but she still stood up again. "Perhaps we need to try again and see if I can kill you or not." Huai Chaosher's face was indeed a little pale, but her hoarse voice was exceptionally calm, as if she wasn't at all affected by the heavy injuries on her body. The human body was the #1 machine, but, after all, it couldn't be a machine. Sulu looked at this inconceivable scene and thought of the uncle's words back then. He used the shortest amount of time to calm down the shock in his heart. Supporting himself against the cold alloy wall, he slowly stood up and forced his mind away from his lower abdomen. He didn't think about whether the intense pain meant that his intestines were broken or not, and gently moved his slightly cracked right wrist. Again, Huai Chaosher slightly raised her face, looking at the ceiling of the cell expressionlessly, and took a deep breath. The unique spirit that seemed to be unique to her once again returned to her body, and all the injuries, pain, and anger disappeared. What was left was only power. Sulu didn't answer. He just narrowed his eyes and clenched his fists again. According to the calculation of the sounds I heard, the two people in the room should have already fought 3 rounds. Guess who has the advantage? That expressionless niece of mine? No, no, no. Although the entire universe knows how strong she is, that Lieutenant Colonel Sulu is Nasri's son after all. If he can have a third of Nasri's wisdom and shamelessness, plus his original strength, Chaosher can't possibly be his opponent. How strong was he originally? I don't know, but according to the speed of his recovery after being paralyzed, he should have passed the legendary level. No one knows what level he can reach in the future. After all, according to the ancient records of the family, the great ancestor who founded the family didn't seem to have broken through this level. Well, that's very painful. Since they're still fighting, it should be a draw. But according to the terrifying battle strength of these two guys, they should have been seriously injured. How can they still fight? I don't know if the bones of these two guys will be fine in the end. Wearing a thin white robe, the great teacher of the empire straightened his teacup and spread his smooth bare legs. He half reclined on the bamboo chair and looked in the direction of the alloy cell. Heavy crashing sounds came from the sealed cell from time to time. The dust on the walls rustled down. It seemed that the thick alloy walls were about to shake under the impact of the bodies of the two people inside. The great teacher seemed to be casually commenting on the battle in the cell, but the anxiety in his eyes couldn't be hidden. He knew what kind of danger every heavy crash represented. Bang, bang, bang. Dull and terrifying crashing sounds kept ringing out from the prison cell. No one knew when it would end, and when it ended, whether the two of them would still be alive. The great teacher was indeed a crazy person, but he wasn't a bloodthirsty person. Especially in his opinion, the two young people in the cell were not only important figures related to the future peace of the universe, they were also his family. The great teacher lowered his head and looked at the rippling tea in his cup. He was silent for a long time. Master, we can't let them continue fighting like this, right? If they really die, your great dream can't be realized. Also, His Majesty will definitely not care about the blood oath. He will directly send troops to flatten the yard. What are you afraid of? A trace of embarrassment flashed across the great teacher's beautiful and graceful face. As if he didn't want his loyal butler to see his anxiety, he put down the teacup heavily beside him and said loudly, "I'm anxious because I can't see what's happening inside." He waved his arms excitedly. The undefeated princess of the empire against the brave successor of the Federation's military god. Do you know what this is? This is history happening, and as the only bystander of a middle-aged historian with a conscience, I actually can't record firsthand. This is an intolerable failure. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu wiped out all the surveillance equipment. The technical department didn't expect this Federation person to be so amazing in this aspect. Nonsense. Don't forget that he is Nasri's son, the designer of MXD. The great teacher lowered his eyes slightly and said after a pause, "Wait a little longer. If the two crazy people inside don't fight each other to death, open the one-way channel. I want to say something to them." The white-haired butler looked at the quiet streets around the white yard with fear and helplessness. He heard the faint roar of fighter jets and the rolling sound of armored vehicles in the distance. He said sadly, "We can wait, but I don't know if the troops outside and His Majesty in the palace can wait. As long as Xiao Shi's life and death can't be confirmed, the Emperor won't go crazy." The crazy great teacher was as calm as a detective at this moment. He said, "Weighing the pros and cons is what a deformed creature like the Emperor is best at. But the problem is that the two in the room, it seems that it's impossible for them to develop a love story according to your plan. They're really fighting with no regard for their own lives. There's no meaning in keeping them locked up like this. What do you know?" The great teacher raised his eyebrows and said mockingly, "Fighting is affection. Scolding is love. It's said that the ancestors of my race used this trick to conquer many powerful women." Time passed slowly. 2 days and 1 night had passed since Su Lu entered the Great Teacher Academy, and 1 day and 1 night had passed since Huai Chaoshi entered the Great Teacher Academy. The Empire finally confirmed what had happened, and the entire upper echelon of Tianjing planet fell into a state of panic and unease. They didn't understand why the important figure in the White Courtyard would imprison the Empire's most trusted and dependable princess. They also didn't understand how he had done it. Countless elite troops of the Empire were urgently mobilized into the capital. They silently and sternly headed straight for the slums. The heavy and huge engineering mechas unceremoniously flattened all the buildings within a few square kilometers. More than 100 wolf, Fong mechas and densely packed armored vehicles were anxiously waiting for orders in the ruins of the slums. They heavily surrounded the White Yard. Without the Emperor's personal order, no one dared to attack this yard. The Empire's military could only watch anxiously and use sophisticated equipment to monitor everything in the yard. They didn't know what was happening in the room. They only knew that from time to time, there would be a chilling sound of heavy impact. It sounded like the ringing of a bell, and every sound would cause people to panic. Chapter 632. The religious ascetics of Bermuda liked to ring the bells the most, but even the most devout ascetics did not have enough willpower and stamina to continue this work for an entire day and night. In the cell of Master White's fan manor, Su Lu and Huai Chaoshi fought valiantly for a day and a night in a dark environment without any bystanders. Finally, they stopped. The bell that frightened the Imperial soldiers outside the courtyard came to an end and did not ring again. It was impossible for two people who stood on opposite sides to become friends, as that crazy Master Fancian had said, and it was even more impossible for them to become partners. But it had to be admitted that in terms of battle, they had always had some sort of tacit understanding, whether it was last year's great escape in the sea of mulberry trees or today's confinement battle. It was always so. At that time, a piece of the soft wall that had been hit by the vibration fell off without anyone noticing, making a soft sound on the rubble. The two people, who were fighting fiercely, slowed down the rhythm of their hands at almost the same time, vigilantly watching each other's every small movement, and slowly retreated to the wall on both sides and sat down. This was tacit understanding, but also helplessness. At this time, Su Lu was already a man of blood. His right arm was completely hanging by his waist, soft as if all the bones were broken. As for his face and abdomen, it was even more bruised and swollen. Huai Caoshi's cheeks were as indifferent as usual, but the blood seeping out from the ribs of her military uniform, her fingertips trembling because of the lack of strength, and her right leg dragging miserably as she retreated, all showed that she was also seriously injured. No one knew how fierce the battle in this confined room was. If it were someone else, they would have died long ago. Only Su Lu and Huai Caoshi, these two people with tenacious vitality, could hold on and keep fighting. But until now, no one was able to kill the other. The strength in their bodies was almost exhausted, and it was difficult for them to bear the high intensity of the battle. Maybe it was just a possibility. At this moment, sitting separately under the two broken walls, the last flames were still hidden in their bodies, waiting to erupt at any moment to burn the most powerful enemy across from them, who seemed like they could never escape. However, the two of them did not move and did not erupt with the last of their life force. It was probably because this cell gave them a strange feeling. They were only separated from the real world by a thin wall. They could break through the wall at any time and throw themselves into the arms of their loved ones and friends who needed them. They should not gamble their lives here. The paint on the wall was still peeling off from time to time, but the two of them didn't look at it. They sat cross-legged by the wall in their usual positions, seizing every moment to recover their strength as quickly as possible. The clear water sprinkled on the dusty ground. Mixed with the smell of blood, there was a faint fishy smell. There was no light in the cell, so it was hard to tell whether it was day or night. The two powerful young men were like wild beasts hiding in their own territories, licking their wounds and accumulating strength, waiting for the next battle. However, their territories seemed to be too close to each other, so close that they could hear each other's breathing and feel what each other was thinking. No one spoke. The passage of time could not be felt in the dark room, and no sound from the outside world could be heard in the quiet environment. However, both Huai Caoshi and Su Lu were very sure that the outside of Master Fan's manor must be very lively. The entire empire must have sunk into madness. They didn't know what the final explosion of this madness would be like. Su Lu curled up his body and coughed violently, continuously wiping the blood flowing from his lips. He thought with a trace of sadness. Even if he didn't die at the hands of Huai Caoshi, How could he escape from the encirclement of the imperial armies with such heavy injuries? Your Majesty, we strongly recommend attacking. Inside the imperial palace, a few officers around 30 years old knelt on the ground, their faces full of excitement as they looked at the supreme existence's back. Their foreheads were full of blood. One of the officers cried out with grief and indignation, "Your Majesty, no one knows if Her Highness is safe inside." Master Fan's manor does not have heavy firepower. As long as you give the order, our troops will only need 3 minutes to end the battle and rescue Her Highness. Your Majesty, please make a decision quickly. The army cannot do without Her Highness. The officers once again knelt heavily on the ground and kowtowed until the wounds on their foreheads burst open again and fresh blood flowed out. The Emperor, Huai Fuchai, did not turn around. His face was expressionless. He did not have any negative thoughts about these officers who dared to rush him. He knew better than anyone what kind of prestige the daughter he was proud of had in the army. The great teacher is Her Highness' uncle. Would he hurt her? Why attack? The Emperor casually waved his hand and said, "If there really is a problem, she will not be able to come out herself. Do you really think you only need 3 minutes to succeed? We have gathered a mecha brigade and 3 heavy mecha regiments." The officers' backs were already drenched in cold sweat. They clenched their teeth and insisted on their opinion. A group attack will solve the problem. The Emperor no longer spoke with these hot-blooded officers loyal to his daughter. He tiredly waved his hand and chased them all out of the imperial palace. Meanwhile, he came to the railing and looked at the endless night and the smear of white on the horizon. He sank into a long silence. After a long time, this man who truly held the most power in the universe muttered to himself, "It turns out that the family of geniuses is prone to producing lunatics and idiots. But if this problem could be solved so easily, that courtyard would have been solved hundreds of years ago." In the distance, light seeped out from the shrouded slums, illuminating that white courtyard exceptionally clearly. The Emperor frowned slightly as he looked in that direction. He wanted to convince himself that he did not need to worry too much about the daughter he was proud of, but he kept feeling that there was a shadow constantly spinning in his heart. In the early hours of the morning, the night was still dark, but the slums of Jingdo were brightly lit. The mechanical army that had solemnly charged into the slums in the name of a military exercise were nervously waiting for orders on the flattened ruins. The Wolf-Fong mecha that reflected the metallic light shuttled back and forth like ghosts, ready to launch a surprise attack on that white courtyard at any time. The slums and pariahs who lived here were blocked far away from the safety line by the police department and the security department. These lower-class people, who worked all day for survival, looked in that direction with faces full of fear. They did not know what had happened. Many of them looked at their homes that had turned into ruins and could not help but begin to quietly cry. At one of the streets, a fat middle-aged woman was squeezing in the crowd and looking in that direction. From time to time, she would fiercely curse at the people who were fighting for space beside her or rudely push away the tall people in front of her. No one noticed that her eyes were filled with deep worry and unease. "Mom, let's go back." Paul squeezed over, sweating profusely. He looked around nervously, tugged at the cheap clothes on his mother, and said in a low voice, "It can't be brother. Even if brother is a noble who is wanted, it is impossible to cause such a big commotion. The white courtyard that is surrounded is not an ordinary place." Aunt Susan ignored her son's persuasion and did not turn around to leave. She only looked gloomily at the courtyard in the distance that was almost impossible to see clearly. After a long silence, she suddenly said, "That child has not come back for more than 2 days. I don't know why, but I know that he is definitely in there. Although I know that you are Nasri's son and perhaps have the ability to avoid the chip's monitoring, I still did not expect that you could actually hide from the Empire's search for so long. I am very curious. Where exactly have you been hiding in this half a year?" In the dark cell without a trace of light, White Saoshir's hoarse and tired voice suddenly sounded. Sulu was a little surprised that she would speak. After a moment of silence, he said, Do you still remember the bet we made on the spaceship? I said that I can escape, but I won't tell you how I did it. The room once again returned to a dead silence. Only the slight flow of the water mixed with gravel on the ground could be heard. It seems that the Security Bureau and the Intelligence Bureau's control of the slums is really very poor. There are too many things hidden in these dark and filthy areas that cannot be exposed. The pariahs have long been accustomed to dealing with the will of the Empire. It is indeed a very good choice for you to hide here. Sulu was slightly surprised. He didn't know if the other party had guessed something, so he naturally refused to answer. But listening to the condescension and contempt in her words, he thought of his dear Aunt Susan and Paul. He couldn't help but shake his head and said, "In my opinion, the dark and filthy place you said is really gentle and benevolent. As for the pariahs you said, they have noble sentiments that you nobles can't compare with. What is the name of the stupid woman who was deceived by you? Susan? It seems that she is the descendant of a low-level noble. It seems that she is really good to you." White Sausher's narrowed eyes glittered in the darkness, not like gems, but like an unsheathed sword. Su Li's pupils suddenly constricted. Forcibly suppressing the shock in his heart and the deeply hidden fear, he said in a deep voice, "You can't find them. You underestimate the Empire's ability." Sulu was silent for a long time. His tired and heavily injured body seemed so weak at this moment. He said slowly in a hoarse voice, "Tell me your conditions." Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes like scimitars and looked at Su Lu under the opposite wall through the dark space. After a long while, she said with strong sarcasm, "This is the Empire, and it will be my country in the future. That Susan is my subject. You want me to use my subject to threaten an enemy of the Federation. This is a humiliation to me. I know the thinking habits of you big shots very well. You want to punish Aunt Susan afterwards, which must be in accordance with the law, but in fact, you are threatening me." White Sausher's curved eyes flashed with strong anger. After a moment of silence, she said indifferently, "I don't care about your understanding. If it is threatening, what can you promise me? Just like you think you understand my thinking habits, I also understand the thinking habits of you moral peddlers. Hypocrisy is your label, and guilt is the biggest source of pleasure for you. If I ask you to commit suicide, will you agree?" Chapter 633. A mother and wife falling into the river at the same time, a child with no mistakes, and a large group of mischievous children standing on the two sides of the track, your loved ones tied up on the torture instruments, and White Sausher's mocking and contemptuous words at this moment. These are the most common problems in the world. These problems might make many people feel struggling, from the inside out, from the roots of their hair to their toes, endlessly painful. However, for Sulu, these problems were just some extremely boring hypotheses. Don't be in a hurry to refute me with those specious logic. For a moralist, morality is only useful as long as it does not harm their core interests. Once your core interests are threatened, you will not hesitate to begin to play the role of the crying victim's family, unwilling to give up a single piece of flesh, but still wanting to seize the moral high ground. Huai Chaoshi coldly waved her hand. In her hand was the life of the slum woman. She wanted Su Lu to die by himself. In her eyes, this was just a joke, but this kind of joke was a bit vicious, directly attacking the heart of those moral peddlers. Su Lu listened quietly, and then slowly opened his mouth to reply as usual, "No, of course I won't commit suicide, but I am not the kind of person you are talking about. As for this, I won't explain." His eyes were bright and burning. Without any emotion, he stared at Huai Chaoshi under the broken wall across from him, and said, "If anyone tries to harm innocent Annies, including you, the only response I can make is to use all methods and power to kill the other party and then save them. Kill. Kill him and the entire steel industry of the Empire like a wild beast?" White Sausher's eyes narrowed slightly, and she lightly laughed. "I know what you're laughing at. You're laughing at my overestimation of my abilities, laughing at my whimsical thoughts." Su Li's voice was hoarse as he replied, "That is because you don't understand what kind of person I am. If you really force me to go crazy, I will become a dog, a dog that salivates fiercely, staring at your calf bone. And no matter the cost, I will pounce on you and viciously bite you a few times. I will bite you until you are covered in wounds and ooze endlessly, transmitting my virus to your body. Don't force me. I will really become a dog, a mad dog. Are you threatening me? What right do you have to threaten me now? Huai Chaoshi frowned and said with a trace of unfathomable emotion. Her Highness' lamentation came from Su Li's self-description. She had not expected that the young man opposite her, who was known for his steadiness and forbearance in the Federation, would be able to so calmly describe the birth of a mad dog. Furthermore, it really made her feel a chill. This man was clearly in a desperate situation, so why did he still dare to threaten her? If that woman named Susan dies, what can you do? Even if you manage to escape, what can you do? In this universe, other than His Majesty, there is no one I truly care about. No matter how much you kill, it will not make me sad or regretful at all. Or are you going to keep killing people in the Empire, like a violent and stupid terrorist who keeps assassinating nobles and military officers? Maybe. Su Li's eyes were still bright and even burning as he looked at the wall opposite him. That warm little courtyard in the slums, that mother and son who had treated him with the greatest kindness in the world, were now in an unprecedented crisis. If something really happened to Susan and her son, he would not be able to accept it. It's not maybe, it's definitely. If anything happens to Auntie and her son, and I manage to escape this time, I will use the rest of my life to kill all the Empire's nobles I can find at all costs. In those few decades, there will be a calm and patient mad dog wandering your land. I bet you won't be able to catch me again. In fact, if it wasn't for that beautiful bastard outside, you wouldn't have been able to catch me this time either. If you can't catch me, Tianjing Planet will continue to bleed. Executing a mother and her son who are not dangerous at all because of anger and forcing me to turn into a rabid dog should do you, your emperor, and your empire no good. After saying this, Su Li stopped talking. The dark cell returned to silence. Only the long and steady breathing of the two people could be heard. Even if the people you want to kill are innocent according to common moral standards, you will still kill them? That's right. This does not conform to your moral standards. Su Li was silent. Huai Chaoshi was silent as well. Although I don't think you can escape, I don't know why, but I am willing to agree to your request and let that Annie of yours go this time. Huai Chaoshi said expressionlessly. According to what we said earlier, you have to agree to a condition of mine. Of course, this condition has nothing to do with the war between you and me. Okay, Su Li replied quickly. The sweat on his back had already drenched his entire body, flowing across his wounds. It was extremely painful. I've seen your files many times and know what kind of role you played in the Federation. You're not a naturally bloodthirsty and violent soldier. You are more like a boring and righteous youth who places morality above his head. This time, for the sake of two citizens of the Empire, you are actually willing to go against your own principles. It seems like you are really scared. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and said indifferently, for a person who has never been afraid of death to be scared to this extent is truly rare. Su Li was silent. Ever since he had confirmed that Auntie Susan could die at any moment, an unprecedented sense of fear had taken over his entire body. Because of this unprecedented fear, he had become crazier than ever. Furthermore, this extreme craziness was hidden in his extreme calmness, and it was clearly transmitted to Huai Chaoshi's mind. It was also because she felt this craziness that Huai Chaoshi made her final decision. I don't like the so-called tragedies of fate. Those are all Dog*T written by Schiller. He lowered his head tiredly and replied, My life may not be a comedy, but a good person should always have a happy or peaceful ending. He raised his head and looked straight at the dark wall and the vague figure. He said, Actually, you're wrong. Many people in the Federation have also misjudged me. Even my closest friends have misjudged me. I am afraid of death. There is no one in this world who is not afraid of death. When I was 4 years old, I was lying in my bedroom, staring blankly at the sometimes gray and sometimes red sky. That day I fell sick. I was very sad to discover that the scenery around me would not change, but we would fall sick. Of course, I don't care if I feel uncomfortable when I'm sick, but the problem is that you will die when you're seriously ill, and you'll also die when you're old. After you die, you don't even know what it is to feel uncomfortable. He raised his left arm, which was the only arm he could barely raise, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He lowered his head and said with a smile, "What is death? There is nothing in death. Those little metal toys, the slag in the mine that shines like diamonds, and a little sister who can't speak with a face as cute as an apple. None of them can be seen, touched, or felt. There is only darkness and silence. No, there is not even darkness and silence. I don't know if I have ever existed or done anything. There are no traces to prove that I have ever existed. If I disappear, perhaps there are people who care, but I can't feel their care. Because in death, even, I do not exist. This is very scary. Too scary." Sulu raised his head and said very seriously, "How can you not be afraid of such a scary thing? Those who are not afraid are idiots, or rather, they do not realize how precious it is to have self-awareness. But the problem is that this most terrifying thing is unavoidable. Then what should we do? Continue." White Saoshir's eyes narrowed in a weird angle. With a rare smile on her lips, she looked at the man of the Federation who was very different from his usual self. Su Li's eyes narrowed, too, as if he was recalling the past and sorting himself. Subconsciously, he waved his hand, as if to drive away the scary prospect, and continued, "Since it is unavoidable, of course, we will have to live more comfortably while we are alive. That is probably the reason why we should enjoy the most pleasure while we are alive." "What kind of pleasure?" Like a cynical subordinate, he shrugged his shoulders, frowned, and quickly dispersed. He said with a smile, "The education rules of human society are too strong and have been deeply rooted in our consciousness. Respect for the old and love the young, loyalty and integrity. These moral views are like a whip. If you touch it, your heart will be whipped. Some people can endure it in exchange for things like money and power, but I don't understand why I have to endure it. I just do things according to these moral requirements of human society. I don't want to be whipped in my life and live with a clear conscience. Isn't that a pleasure? This whip is actually a fire in my heart. When I see those unfair things, those disgusting things, I can't help but burn them. When I burn those things clean, I feel that my eyes are clear and my mood is good. Living like this does not necessarily make my heart strong, but it is comfortable enough. I am afraid of death, and I am not a messenger of justice or a young man. I am just a guy who lives according to his likes and dislikes and the whip of morality in order to seek happiness in life. But if the whip of morality is whipped in the wrong place one day, and I feel that it is unbearable, then I will no longer believe in the placebo of life and become a monster that I don't even know what I will be. The hidden starting point of this state of survival is only to make my life more pleasant. It is the restraint of human civilization for every individual. Back to the whip again. Fine, what I want to say is that this is not selflessness, but the greatest selfishness. Su Li's bright eyes flashed, and he opened his hands and said, "In the end, I have deceived the entire universe. Sometimes, it is a bit embarrassing." The prison cell was quiet for a long time. White Saoshir's voice, full of emotion, rang out, "If there is more of such selfishness, it is not a bad thing." At this moment, another voice rang out in the quiet room. "So, it seems that our whole family are selfish people." Chapter 634. In a cell that had been silent and dark for a long time, a voice that did not belong to Su Lu or Huai Chaoshir suddenly rang out. Naturally, it could only be that master of comparative literature who was crazy enough to carve love and peace on his face. When his voice rang out, Su Lu, who had already spoken a lot, frowned slightly, thinking in confusion that he had already removed all the surveillance equipment in the room. How could that person still hear the voice inside? "I'm very surprised, Su Lu. You can actually think like a philosopher and not like those stinky soldiers who only know how to sit on a rock and smoke. This is very good. It will be very helpful for you to accept my great plan in the end. In the dark cell, Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu looked at each other through the dark air. Neither of them spoke, as if in tacit agreement. These two young experts might have fought against each other for many years, or perhaps they would bite each other like wild beasts in the next moment. But their attitude towards the crazy middle-aged man from the empire outside the cell was surprisingly unanimous. If possible, they definitely would not mind teaming up and tearing that person into pieces. After not hearing a reply for a long time, the great teacher's desire to chat did not find a channel to express. He was clearly somewhat displeased, but in the next moment, his voice became excited again. You have explained the horror of death very clearly, and that is the end of one's self-consciousness. For life forms with self-consciousness, this kind of end is absolutely unacceptable, just like how human society absolutely cannot tolerate the end of self-existence, which is why they created things like love, marriage, family, and motherly love. Regardless of whether it is the literature of the Empire or the Federation, when it comes to describing and explaining death, there is a huge flaw, or perhaps a gap. Black swamps, withered tree trunks, burning underworld, gem-like piles of eyeballs, forest-like white-bone plains. These are all too poetic, and any kind of color to describe the existence of death is a type of beautification. Of course, I believe that the predecessors of human society cannot have thought about death at a lower level than you and me. It is just that they were unwilling to lead the life forms that needed to be anesthetized into the deepest part of grief due to their collective consciousness as a member of the human race. This kind of approach is indeed very beneficial for human society. The great teacher's voice was just like every time he talked about words like literature, peace, and love. It became a little sharp, and within the sharpness, there was a hint of craziness. The lazy birds in the trees, the flowers in the birds' dark beaks, the beetles crawling out of the petals, the beetles pushing the big dung ball joyfully. When the dung ball rolls over a small pool of water, it rains. The water flows into the small stream, and the big river, and the fish and prawns dance. What is this? He's alive. Withered trees, half-rotted eye sockets, stinking birds, flowers that have turned into black ropes, beetles that are only left with empty shells. There is no cloud and no rain for thousands of miles. The earth is dry. There is not even wind. The streams have long dried up. What is this? This is death. Only by recognizing the horror of death can one truly appreciate the value of life. In this vast universe, everything is fake. Only life is real. War is the stupidest decision. Killing is the most irrational game. So we must stop all of this from happening. The great teacher's voice was excited and persistent. The only thing that can stop all of this is love. Only making love. Only the two of you can make love. The great teacher's exaggerated aria kept echoing in the dark cell. The content of this aria was so strange. The current head of this mysterious family seemed to have really pinned the future of peace between the Empire and the Federation on the physical intimacy between Su Lu and Huai Chaoshu. The room was really dark, but Su Lu seemed to see the shock, anger, and disgrace on Huai Chaoshu's face. In fact, his own expression was also very strange. "Looks like your uncle has really gone mad," he said to the woman under the wall in a hoarse voice. "If your subordinate can't come up with a solution, I'm really worried that he'll fill the room with poisonous gas in the next moment." Great teacher, the fan manor should be surrounded by now. This crazy uncle of mine is under too much pressure and is about to break down. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so excited. Huai Chaoshu replied coldly. Although she and Su Lu could not hear the sounds outside the white courtyard, nor could they see the bright searchlights or the dense mechanical army, they knew very well what the situation was like. I'm not crazy. I'm even more unwilling to let two pitiful and cute young children who are forced to bear the cold pursuit of political interests die, the great teacher retorted loudly from outside the cell. When Huai Chaoshu heard this, She casually scratched her slightly wet and messy hair and said indifferently, "Uncle, you should know very well that the two of us are heavily injured with multiple fractures. It's very difficult to make the two of us suddenly flirt and shake the bed randomly." When Sulu heard this, his heart was filled with endless admiration. It turned out that this princess, who seemed to only like dealing with mecha violence, had a literary style that he had never imagined. "We need food and medicine." Huai Chaoshu made her request to the crazy man outside the cell. The passage in the alloy wall opened, and a plate of clean water, food, and medicine for external injuries were sent in. Sulu turned his body with difficulty and took these things down. He looked at the darkness on the other side in confusion. Outside the cell, the great teacher was still using his poetic and sword-like language to comment on life and death, the birth and destruction of the universe, and the attitude that human civilization should have. In the room, Sulu and Huai Chaoshu listened in silence or did not listen at all. They closed their eyes and took long breaths. Suddenly, really suddenly, without any warning, without any preconditions, the chattering outside the cell suddenly stopped. The inside and outside of the cell once again sank into a deathly silence. After who knew how much time had passed, Sulu opened his eyes. He looked in confusion at the outside of the heavy wall and then at the opposite side. At the same time, Huai Chaoshu also frowned because this deathly silence had come too suddenly. The two people in the cell knew very well that, based on the personality of the crazy man outside, it was impossible for him to suddenly stop talking at this time. Something must have happened. The problem was that no matter how they thought about it, they could not guess the truth of what had happened. Huai Chaoshu did not think that her father would dare to go against the blood oath and order the army to attack. Sulu did not think that there was anyone in this world who could silently control the great teacher, who used love and peace as his title, but was actually crazy and terrifying. More importantly, even if he could control him, it would be impossible to do so silently. After a long silence, Huai Chaoshu suddenly said, "Try the water and medicine." Sulu was silent for a moment, then asked, "Aren't you afraid that the water and medicine are poisoned, that kind of poison? Are you talking about the aphrodisiac?" Huai Chaoshu raised her eyebrows slightly and calmly replied, "There is such a possibility, so I suggest that you try it first. In your current state, even if you take the aphrodisiac, there shouldn't be any effect." Sulu was silent and looked down at his lower abdomen. The aftereffects of being kicked by that savage woman a day ago were still there. Although it was not enough to end his bloodline, at least for now, he was definitely unable to make the proper response. The joy of life was helplessness, and the joy of helplessness was probably all in pain and helplessness. He raised his head, wanting to say something, but in the end he did not say anything, because the door suddenly opened. Chapter 635. Earlier, an extremely intense quarrel broke out among the Imperial troops who were anxiously guarding the outside of Master Fan's mansion and had razed the streets of the slums to the ground. The two parties involved in the quarrel were Darcy, the director of the Department of Mobility, and a calm Imperial officer whose face was hidden in the shadows with a calm expression. "Chi Dabing, are you crazy?" "No. Director, as an officer of the Imperial Army, even in the face of such a tense situation, I still won't go crazy. His Highness is still in that courtyard. There is no news of him, and we don't know if he is still alive. You actually want all the troops to retreat. If there is a problem..." Director Darcy pointed at the officer's nose and said in a gloomy voice, "You are just a little major. How can you bear this kind of responsibility?" This Imperial Army officer was called Chi Dabing. He was an outstanding soldier who suddenly rose in the Imperial Army in the past 2 years. During the aristocratic rebellion last time, he showed his strong military skills and strength, which earned him the recognition of the Imperial Army and the new military headquarters. He was temporarily transferred to the Mobility Bureau in the middle of last year and participated in the operation to capture Sulu. It was also this person who almost intercepted Sulu in the underground waterway. Although he failed in the end, he also brought a lot of trouble to Sulu. I know the commander of the Imperial Army admires you, but today's operation is under my command. Director Darcy said coldly. Not to mention, I have a very bad opinion of your past achievements. Chi Dabing was silent when he heard this sentence. He saluted and walked to the broken courtyard wall under the dim morning light. He raised his head and looked at the sky indifferently. He seemed to be thinking about an important problem, but also seemed to be waiting for something important. A few minutes later, the thing he was waiting for finally arrived. Chi Dabing took the light but heavy electronic document from his subordinate's hand. He took a deep breath, and a trace of viciousness flashed across his pale face. He turned around again and walked toward the anxious temporary headquarters. He didn't understand why the organization would take such a big risk and didn't hesitate to expose themselves to tear a hole in the Master Fan's mansion. What exactly happened in the White Courtyard? Who was the one who tore the hole open to let out the person inside? Was the career that he worked so hard for half of his life going to be ruined because of this inexplicable accident? When Chi Dabing walked in front of Director Darcy again, he suppressed the strong sense of unwillingness and sadness. He looked at Director Darcy's face that was distorted by anger and anxiety and said word by word, "Before you repeat your accusation, it's best to read this electronic document, and then I ask you to execute it immediately." Director Darcy frowned and took the electronic document. When he saw the content of the order in the document, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't believe his eyes. However, at the end of the document, there was a black hibiscus electronic seal that had been verified electronically. It was so eye-catching and unquestionable. This was the highest order from the Emperor. Su Lu and Huai Chao Shi, who were in Master Fan's house, did not know that a royal document that had been forged through extremely advanced electronic means had already been sent to the dynasty's troops outside the house. They also did not know that the mechanical troops that had surrounded Master Fan's house for many days and could turn into an iron torrent at any moment were slowly retreating according to this order. In the houses in the slums that had been crushed into rubble, an obscure but very important passage vaguely appeared. They stared blankly at the door that opened silently, the door that seemed to be meant to imprison them for the rest of their lives, to drive them mad with endless darkness, and to turn the madman's absurd ideas of peace, love, and literature into reality, had opened so casually, so inexplicably, and without warning. The light of dawn penetrated through the heavy door, and it was as terrifying as a ghost. The contrast between this kind of psychological expectation and the sudden reality would make many people feel at a loss and unable to move. They would hesitate for a long time before they dared to cautiously poke their heads out. Like a herbivore in a cave, they would humbly observe a few times. However, Su Lu and Huai Chao Shi both loved to eat meat. The nerves in their bodies were the thickest in this universe. They might not be the two most fearless people in the world, but they were definitely the two most powerful people in the world. In less than a second, two violent gusts of wind sounded in the cell. The two people rushed out of the room without hesitation as fast as they could. Since the door opened, it meant that there was a big problem inside the Master Fan mansion. The current situation was completely different from before. The two people trapped in the cell were fighting nonstop. At this moment, the most vigilant thing had changed. What Huai Chao Shi had to do was to subdue or kill Su Lu again, and what Su Lu had to do was undoubtedly escape again. However, Huai Chao Shi had the help of countless Empire Army troops, and Su Lu only had one person. Rushing from the cell into the courtyard, Su Lu, whose arm and lower abdomen were heavily injured, was still a bit faster than Huai Chao Shi, whose thigh was fractured. However, the difference was only a fraction of a second. However, when they entered the courtyard, the two people who should have been running like rabbits and pouncing like tigers were once again stunned. This was because the scene that appeared in front of them was even more shocking than the silent opening of the door. The courtyard under the dim light of dawn was incomparably quiet. There were the sounds of insects in the grass under the trees. There was a recliner on the stone platform, and beside the recliner was a teacup. The hot tea in the teacup was still steaming. However, The great teacher who had trapped them for several days was not in the recliner. The great teacher was in the sky, on the tree. A thick rope hung down from the big tree above. The beautiful, almost demonic middle-aged man of the Empire was hanging upside down at the end, swaying gently in the cool morning breeze. The revered great teacher fan in the Empire was now like a chained-up chicken. His eyes were wide open in shame and anger, and his mouth was stuffed with a piece of underwear. He tried his best to cry out, but he couldn't make a sound. His wide and thin white robe was pulled down by gravity, occasionally brushing against his red cheeks, revealing a pair of bare and well-proportioned thighs and even more bare buttocks and private parts. Sulu, who was in a hurry to escape, froze. He sucked in a breath of cold air. Huai Chaoshi, who was in a hurry to kill, narrowed her eyes. She immediately stopped in her tracks. Sulu didn't think much of it. He was just shocked that such an important person could actually put on such a pathetic appearance. However, for Huai Chaoshi, this absurd scene made her feel extremely alarmed. She knew very well what kind of terrifying person this crazy uncle of hers was in reality. He was actually beaten up so miserably. Who in this universe had the ability to do this? Thinking of a person's name, a name that only existed in her memory in the past of the Empire, Huai Chaoshi suddenly stopped in her tracks. She instantly raised her fighting spirit to the peak, completely ignoring the pain in her thigh. Like a lion, her sharp gaze swept around. Chapter 636. First, I settled the debt. I took 2 days of leave and wrote 2,000 chapters. In total, I owed 17 chapters and 2,000 words. As promised, I would finish it within 9 months. There was no other way out. I would finish it. Then I apologized. Indeed, I had been tormented quite badly recently. Just as I was thinking that I could start to make up for my debt after the wedding, I went to Jiangnan. Jiangnan was good. The scenery was unforgettable. It was just that I went from the north of the Great Wall, which was slightly further. The first night, I asked for leave on the 29th. That wasn't anyone's fault. It was purely my own problem. That night, I was playing and only reached Wuzhen at 6 or 7 p.m. Once we started eating and chatting, it was already late. Whitebird brought us a bottle of water and told us to drink beer. Then at night, Blood Red moved 3 more items from the bar. After drinking a few bottles, Mirror Moon Pass's white wine banquet started again. Even later in the night, I actually played poker with Whitebird 72 and the other fellows until 2 p.m. So this was all my problem. I did play for an entire day. But I really had no choice but to take leave yesterday. When I woke up in the morning, I had diarrhea. The meeting upstairs had already started, but I was still squatting in the toilet. I was embarrassed by the beautiful editor's phone call. Everyone was waiting for me. It was a really bad feeling. Then there was a serious meeting. It was very important and lasted until 1 o'clock. Then I ate as fast as I could and left as fast as I could. In the end, I forgot my charger. Zhang Xiaohua said that she would send me, but she only had time to see Moon Gate and my back. Only Guangguan and I left first. He left because of his book friends and love and work. I left because of love and work and book friends. There was not much difference. The main thing was that I wanted to say that I really wanted to go home early. In the end, yesterday afternoon was really miserable. Guangguan and I switched from a minibus to a taxi to a train. The train ran out of trains, so it was late. We caught it, then changed to the subway. For a whole 5 hours, we ran as fast as we could. In Shanghai's underground space, we could only hear 2 uncles talking. Yuan was better than me. His flight was at 9 p.m., while mine was at 7 p.m. He took the Bambuk and looked at the rebirth office that I recommended. I could only use my phone to read a novel whose name I forgot. The main reason was that I was a little nervous. In the end, when I arrived at Pudong Airport, I found that there was no need to rush at all. I was not afraid of being late because the flight was late again. Then I flew to Tsingtao. As expected, I was addicted to traffic again. When he got home, he was once again ripped off by a taxi. I took a deep breath of Daqing's air and discovered that it was indeed 15 degrees Celsius. I was still wearing my short-sleeved shirt and Chidian Unifying the World t-shirt. And so, the delicate fat cat caught a cold as expected. But it was amazing. When he was writing about these things, his spirit was really quite good. It was much better than when he was writing the novel. Cats, they were really rubbish cats. Finally, I have something to report. Guys, in September, I won your monthly tickets. I'm not being shameless. I'll definitely be updating a lot throughout September, but I'm not going to explode. I'm just making up for what I owe. Don't get me wrong. You can choose not to contribute at all. You can just watch coldly as I write. And you can contribute when you're happy. I mainly need the precious monthly tickets in your hands so that when I make up for my debt, I'll have more of a physiological impulse. Tomorrow, at least 3 chapters. If you went crazy, it might be even more. Chapter 637. Someone was helping him, and that did not include Huai Chaoshi. The hanged great teacher was a mysterious force that could easily open the alloy door. He was obviously not from the Empire. For Su Lu, who had a clear mind and was calm enough, it did not take him too long to come to such a simple conclusion. A naked middle-aged man of prominent status was hanging upside down in the morning light. The strange scene stunned both of them at the same time, and then they immediately sobered up. However, due to the extreme sense of danger hidden in the darkness, Huai Caoshi's reaction was naturally slower than Su Li's. Both of them scanned the nearest place at the same time, trying to find a weapon. As long as they could pick up a gun, they would definitely pull the trigger at the other party at the first moment. After going through so many things and the extremely dangerous battle in the dark room, they had long confirmed that to each other and to each other's world, the other party was the most dangerous person. To be able to kill the other party, any kind of sympathy between heroes and heroines, and the loneliness of being at the top was bullshit. But unfortunately and strangely, the mysterious person who restrained the great teacher and released the 2 of them from the prison cell did not leave Su Lu with a weapon. The morning breeze blew into the white courtyard. There was not a single sound outside the courtyard, and the ignorant eyes of the morning birds were still half closed. Time. What the 2 of them needed the most at this moment was time. Su Lu did not look at Huai Chaoshi. Squinting his eyes, he saw a piece of paper stuck to the hanged great teacher's head. He reached out his hand and took it down at lightning speed. Like lightning, his legs shot out like lightning, and without any hesitation, he rushed toward the towering white courtyard wall with a hint of determination. He glanced at the piece of paper from the corner of his eyes, and a solemn expression flashed across his face. He did not know the arrangements of the Empire's troops outside the courtyard wall, nor did he know how many dangers awaited him. But no matter what, he was not willing to stay in the same place as Huai Chaoshi and foolishly wait for her to summon the Empire's elite troops to kill him 100 times, 100 times, 100 times. Huai Chaoshi looked at the back of the figure that flipped over the courtyard wall like a big bird. A trace of ruthlessness flashed through his eyes that were narrowed like a new moon. He pressed his right hand on his thigh that was in great pain due to the fracture and shouted loudly. With her legs heavily injured, she knew that she had no way of keeping Su Lu here. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but sigh at that guy's luck. In that desperate struggle, the guy had broken countless bones, but his legs were still intact. Shouting loudly was too much like the reaction of a helpless girl who was robbed in a dark alley. Huai Chaoshi hated the shout very much, but if she wanted to make that guy stay, there seemed to be no other way but to shout. There were a few lines of simple imperial characters on the small piece of paper that the mysterious man stuck on Master Fan's head. It briefly described the situation outside the courtyard wall and wrote down an address. Su Lu knew the story behind this incident very well, but he also found it hard to believe that the imperial troops outside the courtyard wall had actually retreated. He was even more puzzled that the mysterious man had directly stuck the paper on Master Fan's head. Was he not afraid that Huai Chaoshi would see it first? With the resolute determination to die, to live and die together, or to survive in the midst of death, Su Lu leaped over the tall courtyard wall. However, he didn't see the torrent of steel that he had imagined. nor did he see countless cannon barrels that were powerful enough to destroy battleships. He only saw a barren ruin in the night. It turned out that what was written on the paper was true. He could faintly see the lights of the Imperial troops several kilometers away. Looking at the night sky at a 45-degree angle, there were roaring fighter jets that were circling at high speed. It was supposed to be a dead end, but it suddenly became a place of life. Sulu was slightly surprised, but he didn't slow down at all. This was because at this moment, Huai Caoshi's furious roar came from the courtyard behind him. After hearing this roar, the Imperial troops that had retreated to the periphery of the courtyard immediately became restless and moved. It turned out that the ridiculously powerful princess could also scream like a normal girl. A hint of a happy smile flashed across Su Li's face, but there was no trace of a smile in his eyes. He stared at the mecha hidden in the forest several hundred meters away. It was a new type of wolf fang mecha that glowed with a metallic color. The micro-engine parts that looked like metal spikes were attached to it. In the dense forest, it looked like the branches of a tree pointed to the sky. It gave off a strong aura of injustice and resentment. The cockpit of this wolf fang mecha was already half open, and there were no Imperial pilots inside. Su Li's hearing was extremely good, so he could clearly hear the low humming sound of the engine in standby mode. The surrounding Imperial mechanical troops rushed toward Master White Fan Manor at high speed, especially the shadows of the dozens of wolf fang mecha. They instantly cut through the air, turning into countless suffocating shadows that quickly closed in. Was this a mecha left for him? Sulu frowned in thought, but there was no time to think further. Stepping on the ground full of rubble and fallen branches of the green trees, he leapt high into the air like a giant bird returning to the forest. With a beautiful flip in the air, he dove into this ownerless wolf fang mech with a whoosh. His back slammed heavily into the seat, causing a sharp pain in those broken bones. His face was pale, but he didn't even make a sound. His fingers quickly swept across the touchscreen, and his left hand pulled on the control stick, quickly pressing the quick trigger button below the stick as fast as lightning, completing his first action. The cockpit door of the wolf fang mecha was forcefully closed, and the hydraulic valve started to creak because of the overload operation. The cannon on the left mechanical arm popped out with a clang. Almost at the same time, the heavy body of the mecha suddenly sank, and the micro-engine at the mechanical knee joint started to hum loudly. Whoosh! A loud and low roar, accompanied by the sound of soil being flipped up, caused the wolf fang mecha hidden in the dense forest to bounce horizontally, dodging two long-range missiles that had just been shot at it. The violent explosion was completely unable to damage the wolf fang mecha at all. With a calm expression, Sulu entered the control order and rushed toward the three Imperial mecha charging at him at high speed. With a flash of lightning, the wolf fang mecha he was controlling instantly accelerated, dragging a few dazzling afterimages behind it, and viciously kicked the stomach of the Imperial mecha charging at the front. At the same time, the sharp spike on the right mechanical arm popped out from under the left mechanical arm and mysteriously pierced into the cockpit of the second Imperial mecha. Having received Huai Caoshi's warning, the first three Imperial mecha to rush over to intercept Sulu were all the most elite pilots of the Empire. Their reactions could not be said to be slow, and the triangular formation they had adopted was also very tight. But unfortunately, just like that sentence that had been repeated countless times in countless novels, the one they had encountered was Sulu. The huge spike on the right mechanical arm was still flashing with terrifying electricity in the Imperial mecha's cockpit. The Imperial mecha that had been kicked away was still retreating pathetically in the air, forcibly adjusting its balance and twisting its entire body in a strange manner. Sulu controlled the left cannon of the wolf fang mecha to open fire. With a simple and direct sound, the bright light of the fire illuminated the dark morning, and the last Imperial mecha was directly blasted to the ground. As this Imperial mecha fell heavily to the ground, the Imperial pilot in the cockpit still could not understand. In such a short distance, how did Sulu dare to open fire? Could it be that he was not afraid of the sputtering shrapnel not afraid of the violent explosion after the mecha was destroyed. The people of the Empire still did not understand Su Lu well enough. Perhaps Huai Chaoshu did, but as the strongest mecha fighter in the universe, she was still within the walls of the courtyard at this moment, looking at the mecha before her with a cold and solemn expression, not yet able to board the cockpit in time. For people like Su Lu, Madman Li, and Huai Chaoshu, as long as they were allowed to enter the mecha, they could do many unimaginable and crazy things. Even if Su Lu did not have the simulation system to help him control the mecha right now, with his left hand gripped the cold control stick, his right hand gently stroking the smooth touch screen as he sat in the stuffy cockpit, feeling the powerful vibrations of the heavy metal body beneath him, endless self-confidence and desire for battle would surge into his body, making him stronger than usual, so strong that it would be difficult to defeat him. In the instant that the autocannons fired, the Wolf Fong mecha he was operating retreated at an incredible speed, nimbly escaping the range of the shrapnel. Then, it turned into a gust of wind, retreating in an eerie manner. It broke 3 thin trees, half of the collapsed wall, and fled westward. Chi Dabing was on a small building in the distance, holding an electronic telescope, calmly and coldly observing all of this. The organization's forged royal secret order could not fool the military for too long, so he had to disappear early. However, for some reason, he did not leave immediately, instead staying nearby to watch the mecha he had specifically left behind. He wanted to know what the organization wanted to do. When he saw that figure leap over the courtyard wall, he roughly understood the military's nervousness and the organization's intentions. However, as he did not have any good feelings towards the people of the Federation, he subconsciously wanted to see that guy die. Of course, a Wolfong mecha could not fight against a heavy mechanical army. He had been hiding in the Royal Special Forces for many years, so he was very clear about the combat strength of the elite troops outside Master Fan's manor. Therefore, he could not help but feel that the organization's arrangement was a bit ridiculous. He held onto the electronic telescope, watching the Dynasty mecha charging over at high speed like a cloud of dust. A cold and disdainful smile appeared on his lips, and he began to sympathize with the fate of that Federation person. However, what happened next made him tighten his grip on the telescope uncontrollably. An angry scream rang out in Master Fan's manor, and an intense mecha battle suddenly erupted between the ruins and the overgrown trees. In an instant, who knew how many bullets rained down and how many sparks lit up the surroundings? However, amidst the rain of bullets and sparks, the figure of that Wolf Fong mecha did not fall. It was as sharp as before, fierce and persistent. Chi Dabing put down his binoculars with mixed feelings. The image of the Wolf Fong mech in battle still seemed to be stuck in his vision. He sighed heavily in his heart. That Federation person who had tried to snatch his way away was actually such a fierce man. It looked like that person really did have a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding. He furrowed his gloomy eyebrows, tidied up everything in the room, and walked down the old wooden stairs into the dark underground passage. He walked towards the contact point that the organization had designated. Chapter 638. In the cockpit, Huai Chaoshu looked through the surveillance screen at the explosions in the distance. She looked at the figure of the mecha that was fighting fiercely between the morning light and the flames. It was as unfathomable as a ghost and as unstoppable as a warrior. Her expression was still very calm as she sent clear orders to all of her subordinates in the system. She had never wanted to kill a person as much as she did at this moment. If Su Lu really managed to escape, how furious would her father be? How great of a loss would the Empire suffer because of this? However, she was not worried that Su Lu would be able to fight his way out of the encirclement. Against the heavy mechanical troops that the Empire had prepared for a long time, a single mecha was definitely not invincible. Furthermore, those traitors who dared to forge His Majesty's orders were most likely the trash of the civilian resistance organization. How could they possibly be able to stop the Empire's iron hooves? Furthermore, she was already seated in her mecha and was about to give chase. The intense battle caused black clouds of smoke to erupt from time to time. The mecha groups on the Empire's side were completely unable to stop him, and the densely packed war chariots were even more unable to catch sight of his figure. The whistling rain of bullets from the fighter jets also often only hit the dust caused by the heavy mechanical feed on the ground. The citizens of the Empire who were watching from the street corners in the distance screamed and fled in all directions. No one knew whether those flying rocks and blind bullets would hit their chests in the next instant. Su Lu controlled the wolf Fong mecha and ran madly through the streets of the slums. He ran again, ran to the west, and then retreated to the east. In front of him were the black muzzles of cannons, and behind him were the mecha groups that had gathered as if they were facing a great enemy. The whistling fighter jets swept past in midair, and there were enemies everywhere. Even though he had previously successfully taken a path, the end of the path had been sealed off again. Fortunately, the surroundings of the Great Master Fan Manor were the largest slums on Tianjing Planet. An area of more than 10 square kilometers had been cleared out by the Imperial armies, and there were countless densely packed houses outside. Millions of people at the bottom of society lived here. Even though the Empire's royal family could treat these people like pigs and dogs, in the end, they still did not dare to use weapons of mass destruction to destroy these people along with the Wolf Fong mecha. That was why Su Lu had the opportunity to run around in a seemingly confident and arrogant manner. The guns and cannons on the mechanical arms of the mechanical suit spat out beautiful flames. The Wolf Fong mechanical suit was like a hurricane mercilessly tearing apart the obstacles in front of it. However, it was unable to control the dense Imperial heavy mechanical army, and the encirclement became smaller and smaller. The dim light in the cockpit shone on Su Li's expressionless face. Ever since he forcefully broke through the space tunnel and assassinated Countess Chaosher, his life seemed to have become one of constant running and escaping. He was no stranger to this kind of tense atmosphere. However, whether it was Sang Shuhai and Huai Caosher's escape, or the difficult escape that night under the lake, none of them seemed to be as tense as the situation in front of him. Facing dozens of the dynasty's newest mechanical suits, hundreds of heavy armored vehicles, roaring fighter jets, and more than 10,000 elite soldiers of the dynasty, escaping seemed to have become an impossible mission. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that he was extremely familiar with the mechanical structure and firepower of the Wolf Fong mechanical suit, in Sang Shuhai's conversation with Huai Chaosher, the mechanical suit under him would have collapsed long ago. What made him even more nervous was that he could clearly see on the radar screen that there was a seemingly normal Wolf Fong mechanical suit moving at a high speed behind him. With just one look, he could confirm that the one inside the mechanical suit that was moving forward in a straight line in the morning sky was definitely Huai Chaosher. If that bitch gets here, I'm not going to live. Su Lu cursed in his heart, somewhat frustrated that Huai Caosher's heavy leg injury had no effect on her mecha operation. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the puddle of smelly water behind the residential building in front of him. Gritting his teeth, he pushed the control stick forward, pushing the speed of the Wolf Fong mechanical suit to the limit, and charged over with a boom. Just as the Wolf Fong mechanical suit was about to enter the puddle of smelly water, a dense hail of bullets finally struck its tough body. The most lethal of all was a high-speed, cruising electromagnetic missile fired by a fighter jet in the sky. Amidst the dust and sparks of the bullet hitting the tough alloy armor, that electromagnetic missile came from the sky, striking the side of the Wolf Fong mechanical suit viciously with a whoosh. Hundreds of graphite lines glowing with faint blue electrical arcs shot out in an instant, wrapping around the Wolf Fong mechanical suit like a tightly woven fishnet. A series of strange metallic sounds rang out, and the sprinting Wolf Fong mechanical suit abruptly froze in midair. Dozens of micro-engines exploded at the same time, and the system was put under a huge load in an extremely short amount of time. Temporarily losing control, the mecha plummeted pathetically into the puddle. The giant mecha that had fallen into the puddle immediately exploded violently. The power of the explosion stirred up a large amount of black and gray sewage, filling the air with a foul stench. A few small shrimps with mud clinging to their limbs leapt into the bushes by the shore, quickly disappearing without a trace. The normal wolf-fawn mechanical suit at the back of the encirclement came slashing over like a sharp blade, but it was still one step too late. It only had time to see Su Li's mecha plummet pitifully into the lake, and then that explosion. The Imperial troops that had rushed to the edge of the puddle began to madly fire bullets at the surface of the water. The rain of bullets made the morning sky turn somewhat red, and steam actually began to rise from the small puddle of water. The cockpit door of the indifferent wolf-fawn mechanical suit by the shore slowly opened, and Huai Chaosher walked out of the cockpit, arriving at the edge of the puddle. Her expressionless face was slightly furrowed, and she stared silently at the chaotic surface of the water. "Your Highness, that person is dead for sure." An Imperial colonel with a face full of mud ran to her side and reported, "That wolf-fawn mechanical suit was hit countless times. With such a violent explosion, there's no way he could have survived." This high-ranking officer knew very well what Her Highness was most concerned about right now, so his report was exceptionally concise and certain. Unfortunately, Huai Caosher's expression did not improve in the slightest because of his confirmation. She stared coldly at the surface of the lake, the wings of her nose twitching slightly, as if she was very disgusted by the foul stench of mud here. "No, he's not dead." Huai Chaosher was silent for a moment, and then opened her mouth to say in a heavy voice, "This Federation person often appears to be hot-blooded and impulsive, but in reality, everything he does is carefully planned and prepared. Colonel Shadow, a puddle of water in the slums, is actually deep enough to swallow a 6-meter-tall wolf-fawn mechanical suit. Don't you think this is very strange?" The expression of the Imperial officer named Shadow beside her changed greatly, and he looked at the surface of the lake in disbelief. He thought to himself, "I saw that mechanical suit explode with my own eyes, so why does Her Highness still insist that this Federation person is still alive? Drain this puddle of water." Huai Chaosher said slowly, "Seal all entrances. Also, I really want to know who left a wolf-fawn mechanical suit for him." "Yes, Your Highness." The officer saluted with a serious expression. What happened later confirmed Huai Caosher's judgment. After the Imperial troops deployed large engineering mechas to drain the puddle of water, they found tons of stinking household garbage in the muddy pond. They hung up the remains of the mechanical suit that had exploded, and they even dug up several large boxes of heavy weapons that were secretly hidden by a famous gang in Tianjing Planet's underground world. However, they did not find Su Li's body. In reality, the Imperial troops found a total of 17 corpses in the puddle of water after it was drained. It was just that these highly decomposed corpses were clearly the victims of unsolved murder cases in the past. The metal balls tied to their skeletal ankles indicated that their identities had nothing to do with Su Li. Huai Chaosher did not stay by the puddle of water to wait for the results, because she knew very well that a person like Su Li would not die so easily. However, she did not return to the palace, nor did she rush to the hospital to treat her injuries. Instead, she walked back to the white courtyard with a lonely expression. An entire battalion of soldiers surrounded the great Master Fan Manor. The heavy firepower that made one tremble with fear was aimed at the courtyard, and it could be destroyed at any time, turning it into a historical relic. With the blood oath between the Baijin royal family and the great Master Fan Manor, without the Emperor's personal order, even the craziest soldier would not dare to act rashly. Even if this generation's crazy great teacher had done such a crazy thing, not a single soldier dared to walk into the completely defenseless great Master Fan Manor. Even Huai Chaosher had sat in the mechanical suit at the entrance of the great Master Fan Manor. The white courtyard was quiet and serene, as if the madness of the past few days and nights, as well as the fierce battle outside the courtyard, had not affected this place at all. Huai Chaosher walked to the two green trees, clasped her hands behind her back, and looked up at the sky. Her face that could barely be described as handsome was filled with an unsuppressible gloom. Her eyes, which were narrowed like a crescent moon, seemed to be able to shoot out angry raindrops in the blink of an eye. The naked great teacher was still hanging upside down in the air, his face flushed. It was unknown whether it was because of his blood pressure or because of the embarrassment of having his precious buttocks and private part seen by his niece. Huai Chaoshu did not put him down. She narrowed her eyes in silence for a long time, and then asked very seriously, "Just now, did that person come back?" Sulu was like a cheerful gopher, crawling, running, and crawling in the dark underground water channel. His body was covered in mud and even more disgusting old ruins. But his expression was extremely cheerful, as if he could not help but laugh out loud in the dark underground water channel. To be able to escape and survive like this, of course, it was worth a good laugh. He looked at the light screen of the map on his bracelet, and his thoughts ran quickly, trying to find a most reasonable way. He was too familiar with this slum area that he had lived in for almost a year, even more so than the people of the Empire. He knew where the smelly pond led to, and he had the map of Tianjing Planet's underground water channel in his hands. More importantly, his temperament determined that he had to have a plan before he had ambitions. It was just that there were many unexpected key links in today's plan. Thinking of this, he could not help but narrow his eyes. Those people who had helped him, who exactly were they? Chapter 639. The most powerful life form in the universe was a crustacean called the cockroach, and Su Li's life form had always been as powerful as the cockroaches. The most powerful life form in the universe that was closest to humans was the rat. Su Lu, who was crawling in the dark underground tunnel with a silly smile on his face, really looked like a big rat with black mud all over its fur. Therefore, even if he was alone in the Empire, facing the pursuit of countless elite troops, he could still live well and run with all his might. However, running always required a goal, and his goal was undoubtedly to return to the Federation, to return to his hometown. Originally, he had pinned all his hopes on the possible spaceship in Master Fan's mansion, as well as a certain spaceship that might exist that surpassed the current level of technology. Unfortunately, these somewhat illusory hopes were all torn to pieces by the crazy artistic middle-aged man, and he even almost lost his life because of it. The illusory hope no longer existed. So how could he go home? Where should he go now? He stopped by a wet sewage treatment pipe and leaned against a mossy wall. After sitting down, he temporarily relaxed, so that the bones in his body that were broken by Huai Caoshu's fists began to express the greatest protest with pain. Even with his terrifying tolerance, he could not help but breathe rapidly for a while before he resisted the urge to groan and let his blurred vision refocus. He definitely could not go back to Aunt Susan's small courtyard. Since the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency had already investigated there, going back was tantamount to suicide. What made Sulu even more worried was whether Huai Chaoshu would abide by the non-binding secret room agreement between the two of them and let go of the kind mother and son. His gaze fell on the note in his pocket. Under the dim light, Su Lu once again carefully read the few lines of the Empire's words and a sketch on the note. He fell into deep thought. He knew that this note, which was obviously hastily written and thus appeared to be very unserious, actually represented a key to a door that led to a certain mysterious force within the Empire. But the problem was, until now, Su Lu still did not understand the origin of the mysterious force within the Empire. Were they nobles or commoner rebels? What was their purpose in helping him? According to the Federation government's long-distance analysis of the thoughts of the people of the Empire, it seemed that there wasn't a single class in the Empire that had even the slightest favorable impression of the Federation. What made him even more alarmed was that in the incident at Great Master Fan Manor, this mysterious power was too strong, so strong that he did not dare to believe it. Under the heavy encirclement of countless Imperial troops, that mysterious faction was actually able to silently enter the Great Master Fan Manor and subdue that seemingly insane but definitely not simple great teacher without alerting anyone. Then, that mysterious faction was actually able to leave behind a wolf fang mech and create a crack in the tight imperial encirclement. According to Su Li's historical knowledge and analysis, it was impossible for such a strong opposition force to appear in an empire like the Baiyan dynasty. It should be known that the prince had participated in the rebellion of the nobles last year. In the end, under the terrifying dictatorship of the empire, he could only end up with a pitiful ending. There were still many unanswered questions. If that mysterious faction was really standing on the opposite side of the imperial family, why didn't they kill Huai Chaoshi back then? Why didn't they even help him kill Huai Chaoshi? Why didn't they kill the great teacher, instead using such a childish method to hang Great Master Fan naked? Great Master Fan imprisoned him and Huai Chaoshi in the end so that they could sleep together naked. The person who made the great teacher become a pitiful man hanging upside down, this method of dealing with it seemed more like a mockery and revenge for the great teacher's crazy attempt. Yes, it was revenge. Revenge from the standpoint of himself and Huai Chaoshi. In the dark underground waterway, Su Li's narrowed eyes flashed with a ray of light, which quickly disappeared. He closed his eyes and recalled all the details he had experienced since he started to escape last year, especially when he escaped from Maple Lake. It was as if there was a pair of eyes watching him, watching his back, some kind of unbelievable conjecture, some kind of reality that he had been anticipating gradually took shape in his mind. Because of the shock brought by this conjecture, he closed his eyes tighter and tighter until his straight eyebrows were knitted together and his shoulders were trembling slightly. 3 days later, the incomparably terrifying incident that shocked the entire Tianjing planet, especially the millions of citizens in the slums, had quietly come to an end. Perhaps the secret agents of the Imperial Intelligence Bureau were still dutifully investigating every clue, and there were countless armed soldiers carrying out strict checks on the main roads outside the slums. However, to the bottom-level citizens who lived in this long and run-down street, their hearts were numb from years of torment, and there were no longer many ripples in their hearts. For them, that terrifying incident was, at most, a topic of conversation after dinner. Life still had to go on. Those poor people who lived around the Great Master Fan Manor wiped away their tears after receiving the extremely meager allowance. They began to expressionlessly collect the bits and pieces of furniture in their homes and the few valuable items buried in the soil from the ruins of their homes. A young man with a pale face, thin body, and sparse eyebrows walked out of a smoke-filled casino. His footsteps were staggering, and his eyes were lifeless. He did not attract anyone's attention. To the citizens of the slums who were busy making a living, a gambling addict like him who spent day and night in the casino and could die on the streets at any time was not worth wasting a second to look at or sympathize with. This young man spoke with an authentic southern prefectural accent and awkwardly tried to get close to the street vendors selling breakfast. In the end, he was still unable to get a few bites of food. He could not help but have a resentful expression on his face as he muttered dirty words under his breath. He put his hands into his pockets and walked shakily toward the side of the alley. This annoying gambling addict was Su Lu. Although he did not manage to get a hot meal from the vendor, at least he confirmed that he did not come to the wrong place. The address left on the slip of paper was an inconspicuous, run-down courtyard in the alley. After successfully escaping from the stinking pond, he did not think of a way to leave the capital full of soldiers. Instead, he chose to continue to stay in the slums. It seemed to be a risky choice, but in fact, he had thought it through carefully. He was not familiar with the other places in the empire, and this area, which was crowded with millions of slums, criminals, prostitutes, and thieves, could really cover him. From a certain point of view, he was more like a member of the slums than those imperial soldiers who were chasing him. That day in the underground tunnel did not last long. Su Lu had always been a person who was good at simplifying complicated problems. Since there was no road in front of him, and the mysterious force left a road, then it was good to simply walk on it. No matter how dangerous the conspiracy was, it would not be as terrible as the anger of the imperial family. Not to mention that the conjecture hidden deep in his heart also needed to be confirmed by contacting the mysterious force. After gently knocking on the door of the sleeping courtyard, after a moment, an expressionless middle-aged woman let him in. Looking at the woman who did not seem to welcome him, Su Lu naturally thought of Aunt Susan. There was no identity confirmation, no inspection, and no secret signal. Su Lu was led into the depths of the rundown courtyard. He even wondered if the other party knew who he was. Oh, this was not a philosophical question, but a logical question. Deep in the rundown courtyard was an open space, surrounded by randomly built wooden houses, which were very good at blocking the prying eyes of the people outside the courtyard. And the car parts and repair tools, placed in the middle of the space, were probably able to successfully hide from the detection of the Intelligence Bureau satellites. Outside the wooden house in the front, right was a row of simple factories. From time to time, the sound of motors rotating could be heard, but because it was still early, the sound was not dense. After observing up to this point, Su Lu could already confirm that this was a stronghold that used the car repair shop as a cover. But he still did not know who the owner of the stronghold was. The scene in the living room on the first floor suddenly changed. More than a dozen shirtless big men stared at Su Lu, who walked in with unfriendly expressions. These big men were burly and muscular, and their hands were constantly fiddling with heavy firepower firearms that were obviously prohibited. What was even more alarming was the dangerous aura that these people exuded, a fanatical aura that did not take human life seriously. What Su Lu cared about was the emotions that these people revealed in their eyes. Disgust, contempt, mockery, cruelty. He was very familiar with these emotions. On the battlefield in the West Woods, he could often see the Empire's soldiers casting the same look at the people of the Federation. It seems that you are very clear about my identity. He stood in the middle of the room and said, and you don't seem to welcome me. But to be honest, no matter where you come from or how you want to cooperate with me, I don't have high hopes for you. At this moment, the man who had been sitting in the chair with his back to him smiled and said, don't worry about our discipline. Although everyone, including me, hates the people of the Federation very much, they are my brothers. Without my permission, no one here will betray you. The man stood up and looked at Su Lu with a smile. He continued, also, you don't have to worry about your safety here. As the biggest gang leader in this district, in fact, this slum area is managed by me, and not His Majesty the Emperor. Su Lu was silent for a moment before he shrugged and replied, gang leader? This is somewhat unexpected. It seems that the person who wants to talk to me should be someone else, someone above you. 3 chapters for today. My condition is still not right. I haven't gone crazy. My writing is indeed average. Tomorrow, at least 3 more chapters. If I go crazy, I'll write more. Chapter 640. Standing in front of him was a man who claimed to be the underworld emperor of the slums. He was wearing an expensive fur coat, but the upper half of his body was completely naked under the coat. The silky smooth fur and tattooed skin intertwined with each other. Between his eyebrows, there was a hint of coldness and a sense of cruelty hidden deep within. It was very successful in not making those gentle and polite words seem out of place with his identity. There was a dark underworld on both sides of the universe. Su Lu, who was born as an orphan in Donglin, was no stranger to the rules of this world. He was clear that in this seemingly bottommost underworld, there would often be some extremely powerful people, and Lin Banshan was one of the most famous representatives. Even in the Federation, which had the protection of the glory of the Charter, no one dared to completely ignore the underworld. Furthermore, this was the Empire's Tianjing planet, the most chaotic and lawless slum. Logically speaking, he should be more polite to this man, but he really wanted to see the person above this person. So his answer was extremely direct and simple, which made him seem a little conflicted and lacking in respect. In the eyes of the burly men holding guns in the living room, Su Li's answer was not only lacking in respect, but also seriously impolite. These men at the bottom of the Empire's hierarchy did not have the slightest good impression of the Federation people. At this moment, they could not help but stand up and curse loudly. They raised the heavy guns in their hands and pointed them at Su Li's head, as if they were about to fire in anger at the next moment. The smile on the face of the underworld leader wearing the fur coat gradually disappeared. His right hand, which was wearing 3 extraordinarily large diamond rings, slowly reached into his collar and gently rubbed the soft and smooth fur and the skin of his chest. Then he shook his head. He did not stop these loyal and bloodthirsty subordinates from impulsively beating up the Federation people. He only reminded them not to use guns and to use some simple violence to let the other party know what was called a heart of respect. The reason he made such a decision was because he was extremely curious. Why did the old man he respected the most value this fugitive from the Federation so much? What kind of confidence did this outlander, who appeared to be the calmest in front of him for the past 5 years, have? Many years ago, on Eastwood Planet, Su Lu had a cold gun barrel pointed at his forehead. He had never forgotten that painful, cold, and humiliating feeling. After so many years, he had experienced being pointed at by a gun so many times that he was almost numb. His calm heart could not produce too much tension. A burly man over 2 meters tall, with a face full of thick brown beard, threw the gun in his hand to his companion. He grinned and revealed an innocent yet cruel smile as he walked towards Su Lu. He rubbed his hands, and the joints of his upper body made cracking sounds that made people's hearts palpitate. It was unknown what kind of terrifying strength was hidden in his tight and protruding muscles. When the armed bandits in the living room saw this scene, they could not help but shrug at the same time. They guessed that this thin and pale Federation person would probably be able to hold on for a few seconds. After that, a few bones would be broken. Su Lu slightly tilted his head and narrowed his eyes at the burly man who was getting closer and closer. Then he frowned. He could tell that the other party would definitely not be satisfied if he did not break a few of his bones. However, too many of his bones had been broken by Huai Chao Shi. It was impossible for him to fully recover after 3 days of recuperation in the dark sewers. He absolutely did not have the thought of breaking another bone to comfort the mood of these Empire gangsters. The burly man grinned, revealing a mouth full of yellow teeth that were as big as corn grains. Several traces of malevolence and cruelty flashed in his eyes that were as round as the mouth of a bottle. He raised his right arm and slapped towards Su Li's head with a whoosh. It was a very simple slap, without any fancy movements. This burly man, as the #1 warrior of this gang, had absolute confidence in his own strength. He believed that this slap would make Su Lu fall to the ground no matter how he tried to block it. Who told him to have a terrifying palm that was even bigger than a small table? Looking at the malevolent and cruel expression in the pair of round eyes, Su Li's eyes narrowed even more. He unexpectedly remembered that when he fought with his teammates on the battlefield in the West Woods, he could always see a very similar primitive and savage, bloodthirsty impulse in the eyes of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. This feeling was very bad, and it made him very unhappy. His left arm, which was barely able to lift up, was lifted up casually right before the palm that was as big as a small table was about to hit him. His left thumb and index finger locked onto the burly man's wrist at lightning speed, and his fingertips sank deep into the 2 cartilages of his wrist. With such a simple grab, the burly man's attack that was full of brute force suddenly stopped in the air. His thick right arm was stiff in the air, and there was no way for him to move an inch further. The expressions of the Imperial gangsters in the living room changed dramatically. They stood up in shock and subconsciously tightened their grip on the guns in their hands. Su Lu silently looked at the shock and unwillingness in the eyes of the burly man in front of him. His shaved eyebrows slightly wrinkled, and he put more strength into his fingertips. His thumb sank a little deeper, like a nail deeply inserted into a piece of wood, and there was no way to pull out. A stream of blood slowly flowed out from the deep hole. The burly man only felt a sharp pain, and the strength he was usually extremely proud of seemed to have been completely drained at this moment. His right arm, which had killed countless enemies, was actually fixed in the air by 2 fingers of this skinny guy. The gangsters were all fugitives who had fought between life and death. Knowing that he had met a tough opponent, the burly man did not have the slightest fear. Instead, the most primitive and savage fierceness in his heart was aroused. He howled like a beast in pain and pulled back his right arm with all his strength. Su Li's 2 fingers were like 2 iron nails. How could he pull back? The burly man should have expected this in advance, but no one would have thought that the brute force resistance was only a facade. His empty left hand reached behind his waist and grabbed the handle of the alloy military knife. What was more dangerous was that he suddenly exerted strength in his waist, preparing to lift up his thigh that was thicker than a child's waist. Even if Su Lu could block the sinister attack of the military knife, there was no way he could block this furious kick to his lower abdomen. Su Li's bones were broken, and his lower abdomen was also heavily injured. He was extremely angry that these imperial people once again attacked these places. It had to be known that his injuries were bestowed upon him by that insufferably arrogant highness. What qualifications did these gangsters have to follow in Huai Caoshi's footsteps? With a flip of his wrist, he valiantly twisted the burly man's arm. His 2 undamaged feet strangely jumped below. The posture that was deeply rooted in his bones and muscles perfectly appeared on the scene. The moment the burly man was about to lift his leg, his left foot had already moved first. It was extremely precise, and it ruthlessly stomped down without reason. The left foot that was wearing a hard-bottom leather boot fiercely stomped down on the back of the burly man's right foot. It was as if a large iron hammer was ruthlessly smashing down on a flour plate. A clear and terrifying sound of bones breaking erupted from below. The burly man's complexion immediately became pale. His mouth opened wide, and a cry of pain sounded from between his large yellow teeth. Su Li didn't have the desire to listen to a burly man scream like a woman. Immediately after, his body moved forward again, and his knee fiercely struck the burly man's knee joint. Almost at the same time, his body strangely made a similar movement in the air. His right leg drew an arc diagonally outwards, and as fast as lightning, it struck the burly man's waist. The front knee directly deformed the burly man's knee joint, and it terrifyingly twisted backwards. The back knee accurately struck the burly man's right hand that was holding the military knife. The tremendous force caused blood to instantly spurt out from the tiger's mouth. The 3 precise, fast, and ruthless attacks at close range didn't give the burly man any chance to cry out in pain. The powerful lethality and the overlapping waves of pain made this person fall heavily to the ground like a small mountain. The impact made the floor of the living room tremble slightly, and then he fell unconscious. All of this happened too quickly. The gangsters in the living room didn't have time to react or rescue at all. They could only watch with wide eyes as that thin youth from the Federation moved forward like a demon, leaping sideways and turning his companion into an unconscious lump of meat. What made them feel incomparably terrified was that this Federation youth's close-range combat skills were so powerful that they couldn't find any words to describe them. It was clearly a very simple movement, but it contained such inconceivable power. These movements clearly didn't seem fast, and they were extremely clear, but they always gave people a feeling that they couldn't keep up with his rhythm. Many guns were raised again, and they aimed at Su Lu. However, at this time, these gangsters' hands were slightly trembling, and they couldn't be as relaxed and contemptuous as before. They kept feeling that even if they opened fire immediately, they might not be able to kill this Federation youth who was quietly standing in the living room. It was because he was too quiet. Su Lu slowly retracted his left foot. He didn't look at the burly man's instep that was rapidly swelling like a rotting cake. He withdrew his gaze and quietly looked at the leader of these people, the man who called himself the Emperor of the Empire's gangsters. The building was deathly silent. After a long period of silence, the naked man wearing a fur coat frowned, lit a cigarette, and said, "My name is Muin. All of us here are my brothers. We don't have the slightest good impression of the Federation people, but we live in a world where the strong preys on the weak. Your performance just now should be qualified to win our respect." "Mr. Muin, hello," Sulu said. "I still really want to meet the person above you." There was someone upstairs, and there was always someone upstairs. A blurry face appeared in the shadows of the second floor. Muin followed Su Li's gaze and looked upstairs. When he saw that face nod, he couldn't help but frown and make an inviting gesture. "My name is Voss. I'm currently leading the underground resistance. From the day I was born, my life's mission was to lead the oppressed and bullied lowly and commoners to use all means possible to resist the bloody rule of the Empire's emperor, to overthrow this backward government formed by warmongering maniacs and shameless nobles, and to seek a more free, peaceful, and prosperous future for the 87. 4 billion people in the 47 star systems of the left Sky Star region. In the past 20 years, our cause has suffered unprecedented setbacks. Millions of brave warriors, armed with crude weapons, resisted the royal family's battleships, cannons, and mechas, but after paying a price as high as a river of blood, we still couldn't find any hope of success. Until your appearance. In the dark room on the second floor, the thin old man sitting on the high back chair slowly turned around. The wrinkles and yellow-brown spots on his face made his originally white skin look extremely ugly. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.